The piano should have been silent. It sat in the corner of the Sterling Industries executive ballroom, untouched for years, a relic of corporate vanity draped in holiday greenery. But on Christmas Eve, while champagne flowed and Manhattan's elite celebrated beneath crystal chandeliers, Ethan Hale made a choice that would shatter 16 years of carefully constructed lies. His fingers found the keys, and the first notes of a melody stopped Victoria Langford mid-sentence. Her champagne glass slipped. Because the song filling that glittering room was impossible, a love song written for her by a boy who died before he could finish it, a song no living person should know. If you're ready to discover how one melody can unravel a lifetime of secrets, stay with me until the end. And when you're done, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The maintenance closet on the 43rd floor of Sterling Industries smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Ethan Hale didn't mind. After 6 years of working nights in this building, the sharp chemical scent had become as familiar as his own reflection, though lately he'd been avoiding mirrors altogether. "Daddy, are you almost done?" 7-year-old Sophie sat on an overturned bucket, her legs swinging as she colored in a battered notebook. Her dark hair fell in waves around her face, still damp from the snow that had started falling an hour ago. She wore her best dress, the blue one with white flowers that Ethan had found at the thrift store last month, because he'd promised her something special tonight. "5 more minutes, sweetheart," Ethan said, wringing out his mop. "Just need to finish this hallway, then we can go." "But you said we'd see the party." Sophie's lower lip jutted out in that way that made Ethan's chest ache. She looked so much like her mother in these moments, the same stubborn hope in her eyes, the same refusal to accept disappointment without a fight. "We will," Ethan promised. "From the service corridor, you'll be able to see through the glass doors, all the fancy dresses and the decorations, just like I said." Sophie's face brightened. "And the piano?" Ethan's hand stilled on the mop handle. "Maybe, if someone plays it." "You should play it, Daddy. You're the best piano player in the whole world." The words hit harder than Sophie could know. Ethan forced a smile, pushing the maintenance cart toward the hallway that led to the executive level. "Come on, Firefly. Let's get this done so we can see the party." The 45th floor was a different world. Here, the carpets were plush beneath Ethan's worn work boots, the walls adorned with original artwork that probably cost more than he'd earn in a lifetime. Through the tall windows, Manhattan spread out like a circuit board of light, the city glittering with the promise of Christmas morning. The party was already in full swing when they reached the service corridor. Ethan positioned Sophie at the narrow window in the door, lifting her so she could see into the ballroom. Her gasp of delight made everything, the double shift, the ache in his back, the constant weight of being not quite enough, worth it. "It's beautiful," Sophie breathed. "Look at all the lights." Ethan looked. The Sterling Industries executive ballroom had been transformed into a winter wonderland of white and silver. Ice sculptures gleamed on tables laden with food he couldn't name. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than his car moved like choreographed dancers across marble floors. A 12-foot Christmas tree dominated one corner, every branch heavy with ornaments that caught the light from 3 massive chandeliers. And in the far corner, mostly hidden by strategically placed decorations, sat the piano. It was a Steinway grand, black as midnight, its surface polished to a mirror shine. Ethan could see the reflection of the party in its lacquered curves, the distorted images of people who belonged in rooms like this. People who had never scrubbed toilets or worried about whether their daughter's shoes would last another winter. People who had never thrown everything away for a lie. "Why is no one playing the piano?" Sophie asked. "If I had a piano like that, I'd play it all the time." "Some things are just for show," Ethan said quietly. "Not for using." "That's silly." Sophie pressed her nose against the glass. "Hey, Daddy, who's that lady? The one everyone's looking at?" Ethan didn't need to ask which one. There was only one woman who could command a room like that, who could make hardened businessmen straighten their spines and ambitious executives smooth their ties with nervous hands. Victoria Langford stood in the center of the ballroom like a queen holding court. She wore a dress the color of champagne, simple in design but devastating in execution, the kind of elegance that came from not needing to try. Her dark hair was swept up, revealing the long line of her neck, and her eyes, gray as winter clouds, surveyed the room with the focused intensity of someone who saw everything and revealed nothing. "That's Ms. Langford," Ethan said, his voice carefully neutral. "She's the CEO, the boss of the whole company." "She's pretty," Sophie observed, "but she looks sad." Ethan blinked. "What makes you say that?" "Her smile doesn't reach her eyes. Mrs. Chen at the grocery store explained it to me. She said some people smile with their mouths, but not their hearts." From the mouths of babes. Ethan watched Victoria accept congratulations and well wishes with practiced grace, her posture perfect, her responses timed to perfection. To everyone else, she probably looked triumphant. Sterling Industries had just closed the biggest acquisition in its history, and the woman who'd made it happen was barely 32 years old. But Sophie was right. There was something hollow in Victoria's smile, something mechanical in the way she moved through the crowd. Like she was performing a role she'd learned long ago and could no longer escape. "All right, Firefly," Ethan said, lowering Sophie back to the ground. "We should go. I need to finish—" "Wait!" Sophie grabbed his arm. "Someone's going to make a speech." Sure enough, the crowd was parting, forming a semicircle around a raised platform where Victoria now stood. Next to her, looking like he'd stepped out of a cologne advertisement, was a man Ethan recognized from the executive directories, Marcus Ashford, heir to the Ashford media empire and Victoria's fiancé. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate not just the holidays, but a triumph that will reshape this industry for decades to come." Ethan should have left. He had floors to clean, trash to collect, a daughter who needed to be in bed before midnight. But something kept him rooted in place, Sophie's small hand in his, watching through the glass as Victoria stood beside her fiancé with all the warmth of a marble statue. "The Sterling-Baxter merger represents more than just business acumen," Marcus continued. "It represents the vision and determination of one extraordinary woman. Victoria Langford took a company her father built from the ground up and transformed it into an empire. She saw what others couldn't see, risked what others wouldn't risk, and achieved what others claimed was impossible." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Victoria's expression never changed. "But tonight," Marcus said, reaching for Victoria's hand, "I want to share something more personal. Victoria and I met 5 years ago at a charity gala much like this one. I was immediately struck by her brilliance, her drive, her absolute commitment to excellence. Over the years, I've watched her navigate challenges that would have broken lesser people. She's never wavered, never compromised, never let sentiment cloud her judgment." Ethan felt something twist in his chest. The words were meant as compliments, but they sounded like an indictment. Never let sentiment cloud her judgment, as if caring too much was a weakness to be overcome. "That's why," Marcus continued, his smile broadening, "I know our partnership will be as successful as the merger we're celebrating tonight. A toast." He raised his glass. "To Victoria Langford, the most formidable woman I've ever known." "To Victoria," the crowd echoed. But Victoria herself didn't drink. Her glass remained at her side, her eyes distant, focused on something beyond the ballroom walls. For just a moment, something flickered across her face, a flash of pain so raw it made Ethan's breath catch. Then it was gone, replaced by that perfect, practiced smile. "Thank you all," Victoria said, her voice clear and controlled. "Tonight is indeed a celebration of what's possible when we refuse to be limited by conventional thinking. Sterling Industries has always pushed boundaries, and this merger is simply the next evolution of that vision. So please, enjoy the evening. You've all earned it." More applause. The crowd began to disperse, gravitating back toward the champagne and the hors d'oeuvres. Victoria descended from the platform, immediately surrounded by congratulating executives and board members. Marcus followed, possessive hand at the small of her back. "Can we see more?" Sophie asked. "Please, Daddy, just a little longer." Ethan checked his watch. It was nearly 9. He had another 3 hours of work ahead of him, and Sophie would be falling asleep soon. But the hope in his daughter's eyes was impossible to resist. 10 more minutes, he said. "Then we really have to go." Those 10 minutes changed everything. It started innocently enough. Sophie, tired of standing, had wandered down the service corridor to a small alcove where the cleaning supplies were stored, Ethan kept one eye on her and one on the party, watching Victoria navigate the crowd with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this her entire life. She was good at it, he'd give her that. Every conversation seemed to end exactly when she wanted it to, every laugh timed to perfection, every touch calculated for maximum effect. It was like watching a chess master work, each move planned 3 steps ahead. Then her father appeared. Ethan recognized Charles Langford immediately, silver-haired, imposing, with the kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. He'd founded Sterling Industries 40 years ago, and had only recently stepped back to let Victoria take the reins. But stepping back didn't mean stepping away, and from the look on Victoria's face as he approached, his presence tonight was not entirely welcome. The conversation was too far away for Ethan to hear, but body language told the story. Charles was animated, gesturing with his champagne glass, his expression intense. Victoria stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, her face a mask of polite attention. But her hands, those told a different story. They were clenched at her sides, fingers white with tension. Whatever Charles was saying, it was not congratulations. The conversation ended abruptly. Charles stalked away, leaving Victoria standing alone in the middle of the glittering ballroom, surrounded by celebration but utterly isolated. For just a moment, her mask slipped. The careful control shattered, and what Ethan saw underneath made his chest constrict with recognition. Exhaustion. Bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. He knew that feeling. He'd been living with it for 6 years. "Daddy, look what I found!" Ethan turned to find Sophie emerging from the alcove, her eyes bright with excitement. "There's another door here. It goes right into the party room." Sophie, no. But she'd already pushed through the service entrance, the door that maintenance used to discreetly access the ballroom for quick cleanups. Ethan's heart stopped as his daughter, in her thrift store dress and scuffed shoes, stepped into the most exclusive party in Manhattan. He lunged after her, catching her hand just as several heads turned their way. "I'm sorry," Ethan stammered, pulling Sophie back toward the service entrance. "She didn't mean, we were just, Daddy, the piano." Sophie pulled against his grip, her voice carrying across the sudden pocket of silence. "Can't you play it? Just one song? You promised we'd—" "Sophie, we need to go." Ethan's voice came out harsher than he intended, born of panic and shame. Several executives were staring now, their expressions ranging from confusion to distaste. Marcus Ashford looked positively affronted, as if the presence of the help had personally insulted him. But Victoria's expression was different. She stared at Sophie with something that looked almost like longing, as if the sight of a 7-year-old's unbridled enthusiasm had cracked something inside her careful armor. "Please don't be angry," Sophie said, her voice small now, aware she'd done something wrong, but not quite sure what. "I just wanted to hear Daddy play. He plays so beautiful, and the piano was just sitting there, and it's all right." Everyone turned. Victoria had spoken, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence like a knife through silk. She moved toward them with the fluid grace of someone who owned not just the room, but the entire building. "What's your name?" Victoria asked, crouching down to Sophie's level. "Sophie. Sophie Hale." Her daughter's voice was barely a whisper now. "Well, Sophie Hale, you're absolutely right. That piano is just sitting there, and that is a terrible waste." Victoria glanced up at Ethan, and for just a second he could have sworn he saw recognition flicker in her eyes. "Does your father really play?" "He's the best," Sophie said with fierce loyalty. "He plays every night before I go to bed. He knows a million songs." "Is that so?" Victoria stood, her gaze now fully on Ethan. "I don't think we've met. You work here?" "Night maintenance," Ethan managed, acutely aware of his janitor's uniform, the mop bucket still visible through the service entrance, the vast gulf between his world and hers. "I'm sorry for the interruption. We'll leave immediately." "Don't apologize." Victoria's voice was firm. "And don't leave. If your daughter wants to hear you play, then you should play." "Ms. Langford," Marcus appeared at her elbow, his smile tight. "I'm sure the gentleman has work to do. Perhaps we should—" "I'm sure the gentleman can spare 5 minutes," Victoria cut him off smoothly. She looked back at Ethan, and there was something in her eyes now, something that looked almost like a challenge. "Unless you'd prefer not to?" Ethan's hands were shaking. The piano sat across the ballroom, silent and waiting, an instrument he had no business touching. He hadn't played in front of anyone but Sophie in years, hadn't wanted to, hadn't dared to. But Sophie was looking at him with such hope, and Victoria was looking at him with such strange intensity, and suddenly Ethan was so tired of hiding, so exhausted by the weight of everything he'd given up and lost. "All right," he heard himself say, "one song." The walk across that ballroom was the longest of Ethan's life. Every eye was on him, the maintenance man in his cheap uniform, escorting his daughter to the Steinway Grand like he had any right to touch it. Whispers followed in his wake, amused and scandalized in equal measure. Ethan blocked them out. He focused on Sophie's hand in his, on the familiar weight of her trust, on the piano growing closer with each step. When he reached it, he pulled out the bench and sat down. Sophie climbed up beside him, her small body warm against his side. The keys stretched before him like old friends he'd tried desperately to forget. "What should I play, Firefly?" he asked softly. "The special song," Sophie said immediately. "The one you never finished." Ethan's blood turned to ice. "Sophie, I don't think—" "Please, Daddy. It's so pretty. And you said maybe someday you'd finish it." He should have refused, should have played anything else, a Christmas carol, a popular song, something safe and forgettable. But his hands were already moving, finding the opening notes of a melody he'd written 16 years ago in a cramped room at a summer music camp when he was 17 and stupid enough to believe that talent mattered more than money, that love could overcome anything, that the future was his for the taking. The first notes fell into the silence like stones into still water. Across the ballroom, Victoria Langford froze. The melody was simple at first, almost hesitant, like someone testing the ice of a frozen lake. But then it built, layer by layer, each phrase adding complexity and depth. It wasn't showy. There were no dramatic runs or ostentatious displays of technical skill. Instead, it was honest. Achingly, devastatingly honest. It was the sound of longing, of love offered without expectation of return, of seeing something beautiful and knowing you could never possess it, never deserve it, but loving it anyway with every fiber of your being. Ethan had written it for a girl he'd met that summer, a girl so far above his station that even speaking to her had felt like theft. She'd been brilliant and fierce and desperately unhappy beneath her perfect facade. He'd been invisible and poor and foolishly convinced that music could bridge the gap between their worlds. He'd been wrong, of course, but for one summer he'd allowed himself to hope. The melody shifted, moving into the second movement. His fingers found the keys automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. This section was more complex, filled with tension and unresolved harmonies that pushed against each other like opposing forces. Sophie swayed beside him, her eyes closed, humming along to the parts she knew. She had no idea what this song meant, no understanding of the history woven into every note. To her, it was just Daddy's special song, the one that made her feel safe. But to Ethan, it was a ghost, a reminder of everything he'd lost and everything he'd never had the courage to keep. The ballroom had gone completely silent. The party had stopped, every conversation abandoned, every glass lowered. All eyes were on the janitor at the piano, this nobody in his maintenance uniform, coaxing impossible beauty from the Steinway's keys. And at the center of it all, Victoria Langford stood motionless, her face drained of color, one hand pressed against her chest, as if physically holding her heart inside her body. Because she knew this song. Not the second movement. That was new, something Ethan had added over the years in the privacy of his small apartment when the loneliness got too heavy and the only way to survive was to pour it into music. But the first movement, that opening melody, those initial phrases that had stopped her mid-breath, she knew them because they'd been written for her 16 years ago by a boy named David Chen who'd died before he could finish them. A boy who'd been Ethan's best friend and the only person who'd ever believed in his talent. A boy who'd loved Victoria Langford with the kind of pure, selfless devotion that exists only in the hearts of the young. A boy who'd taken Ethan's song with him to the grave because Ethan had been too much of a coward to claim it as his own. The third movement began, and with it came the resolution Ethan had never found in life. The tension eased, the opposing forces finding harmony, the longing transforming into something that wasn't quite peace but wasn't pure pain either. It was acceptance. The understanding that some things are beautiful precisely because they're impossible, that some loves are meant to be held in the heart rather than the hand. Ethan's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing back tears, pouring every ounce of emotion into the keys beneath his fingers. Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder, and that small gesture of trust gave him the strength to push through to the end. The final notes hung in the air like the last stars before dawn. Ethan's hands stilled on the keys, his breathing ragged, his entire body trembling with the effort of keeping himself together. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. Then Sophie lifted her head and smiled up at him. "That was beautiful, Daddy." The spell broke. Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. But Ethan barely heard it. He was looking at Victoria, at the woman standing in the center of the ballroom with tears streaming down her face, her perfect composure shattered completely. She was staring at him like she'd seen a ghost. "Where did you learn that?" Victoria's voice cut through the applause, sharp and demanding. She was moving toward him now, pushing through the crowd with single-minded intensity. "That song! Where did you learn it?" Ethan stood, positioning himself between Victoria and Sophie on instinct. "I should get back to work." "No." Victoria was close now, close enough that he could see the storm in her gray eyes, the carefully controlled fury and confusion warring across her features. "You don't get to play that and walk away. That song was written by someone I knew, someone who died 16 years ago. So I'll ask you again, where did you learn it?" The entire ballroom was watching now. Marcus had moved to Victoria's side, his hand on her elbow, his expression caught between concern and irritation. Charles Langford watched from across the room, his eyes sharp and assessing. Ethan felt the walls closing in. This was it. The moment he'd been dreading and avoiding for 6 years. The moment when the past caught up with him and everything he'd built came crashing down. "I knew David," he said quietly. "David Chen. We went to summer music camp together. He taught me the song." It was a lie. But it was the only lie he had left. "That's impossible." Victoria's voice was shaking now. "David never taught anyone that song. He barely had it finished himself. He was still working on it when he—" She stopped, unable to say the word. "Died. When he died in a car accident 2 weeks after camp ended, taking with him every dream he'd ever had. Maybe you didn't know him as well as you thought." The words came out harsher than Ethan intended, born of panic and self-preservation. People keep secrets, even from the people they love. Victoria flinched like he'd slapped her. "You didn't even play it right. The second movement is wrong. And the ending? David never wrote an ending. Maybe he told it to me before he died." Ethan was backing away now, taking Sophie's hand, desperate to escape before he said something he couldn't take back. Maybe he wanted someone to finish it. "Who are you?" Victoria demanded. "What's your name?" "Ethan. Ethan Hale. I work here, night maintenance, that's all." "That's not all." Victoria moved closer, her eyes searching his face like she was looking for something she'd lost. "You're lying. I can see it. That song was David's, and you're— Ms. Langford, perhaps we should discuss this in private." Marcus's voice was smooth, professional, the voice of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, and creating a scene in front of your guests is— I don't care about the guests." Victoria never took her eyes off Ethan. "I care about the truth." "The truth is I'm a janitor who plays piano for his daughter," Ethan said firmly. "The truth is I learned a song from a friend who died. The truth is I should never have played it here, and I'm sorry for the disruption." He turned to leave, pulling Sophie with him, desperate for escape. But Victoria's voice stopped him one more time. "The bridge." Her voice was different now, quieter, almost broken. "In the second movement, that progression, the way you modulated from E minor to G major. David couldn't figure that out. He tried for weeks, but he could never make it work. He said it was missing something he didn't know how to find." Ethan's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might shatter his ribs. Maybe he figured it out before he died. "Or maybe," Victoria said softly, "he didn't write it at all." Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Ethan saw recognition dawn in her face. Not full understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it. The first crack in the story he'd been telling himself for 16 years. "Daddy, I'm tired." Sophie tugged at his hand, her voice small and uncertain, aware of the tension even if she didn't understand it. "I know, Firefly. We're leaving now." This time, Victoria didn't stop him. She stood frozen in the center of her glittering ballroom, surrounded by wealth and power and everything she'd fought so hard to achieve, watching a janitor and his daughter disappear through the service entrance like they'd never been there at all. But Ethan knew better. He'd cracked her armor, broken through her careful control, and that kind of damage couldn't be undone with time or distance. The past wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. The service corridor was blessedly empty. Ethan's hands shook as he grabbed his maintenance cart, his breath coming in short gasps. Sophie was crying quietly, confused and scared by what had just happened. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered. "I didn't mean to make trouble." "You didn't, sweetheart." Ethan knelt down, pulling her into a fierce hug. "None of this is your fault, I promise." Why was that lady so angry? She wasn't angry, she was just surprised. Because of the song? Because of the song, Ethan confirmed. He pulled back, wiping the tears from Sophie's cheeks with his thumbs. "But it's okay. We're okay. Let's get you home." They made it to the elevator before Ethan heard footsteps behind them. He turned, expecting security, expecting to be fired on the spot for his presumption. But it was Charles Langford who stood in the corridor, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hale," he said. "A word?" Ethan's stomach dropped. "Sir, I apologize for the disruption. It won't happen again." "I should hope not." Charles moved closer, his eyes sharp and assessing. "That was quite a performance. Tell me, where exactly did you study music?" The question was casual, but Ethan heard the trap beneath it. "I didn't. I'm self-taught." "Self-taught?" Charles's eyebrows rose. "Fascinating. And David Chen, you were friends?" "Yes, sir, at camp, a long time ago." Charles was quiet for a moment, studying Ethan with the kind of intense focus that had built an empire. "My daughter is upset. She doesn't get upset easily. That song meant something to her." "I'm sorry, I didn't know she'd be here. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't." Charles's voice was cold now. "But you're thinking now, aren't you? Thinking about how you might leverage this little incident. Perhaps you believe Victoria's emotional reaction makes her vulnerable. Perhaps you think you can exploit that vulnerability for your own gain." Ethan's jaw clenched. "I don't want anything from your daughter." "Everyone wants something, Mr. Hale. In my experience, the people who claim otherwise are simply better liars." Charles stepped closer, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "So let me be very clear. You will not speak to Victoria again. You will not play that song again. You will finish your shift tonight, and tomorrow you will tender your resignation, quietly, professionally, with no fuss and no demands." "I need this job," Ethan said quietly. "I have a daughter to support. And I have a daughter to protect." Charles's expression didn't change. "I'm sure you understand. A man like you, with your circumstances. You know how easily things can be made difficult, how quickly opportunities can disappear." The threat was clear. Ethan looked down at Sophie, at his daughter, who was trying so hard to be brave, and felt the familiar weight of helplessness settle over his shoulders like a lead cloak. "I understand," he said. "Good." Charles reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. 3 months' salary, more than generous under the circumstances. You'll find the resignation letter inside. Sign it and leave it with building security tonight. Ethan took the envelope with numb fingers. Charles Langford turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving Ethan alone with his daughter and the ruins of the only stable job he'd had in years. "Daddy?" Sophie's voice was very small. "Are you okay?" No. He wasn't okay. He'd been not okay for 6 years, ever since the accident that had shattered his hand and his career, ever since Sophie's mother had walked out because she couldn't handle being married to a failure, ever since he'd accepted that the life he'd dreamed of was never going to be his. But Sophie didn't need to know that. Sophie needed him to be strong. "I'm fine, Firefly," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "Just tired. Let's go home. They rode the elevator down in silence, walked through the lobby where security guards pretended not to see them, stepped out into the snow that was falling harder now, turning Manhattan into a blur of white and shadow. Ethan's car was parked 3 blocks away, in the only lot he could afford. By the time they reached it, both he and Sophie were covered in snow, shivering in the winter cold. He helped Sophie into her car seat, made sure she was buckled safely, then sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His hands were still shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash, the weight of what had just happened settling into his bones. He'd played the song. After 6 years of hiding it, of pretending it didn't exist, of letting everyone believe David had written it, he'd played it in front of the one person who could recognize it. And now everything was falling apart. Ethan pulled out the envelope Charles had given him. Inside was a check and a pre-written resignation letter. The money was good, more than generous, just like Charles had said. Enough to keep them afloat for a few months while he looked for another job. But it was also the price of his silence, the cost of disappearing back into the shadows where people like him belonged. In the back seat, Sophie had fallen asleep, her head tilted against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She looked peaceful, innocent, completely unaware that her father had just destroyed their stability for 5 minutes at a piano he had no business touching. Ethan started the car and pulled out into the snowy streets. The drive home was slow, traffic crawling through the storm, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of a summer 16 years ago, when he'd been stupid enough to believe that talent could overcome poverty, that love could conquer class, that he could be someone other than who the world told him he was. He'd learned better. David's death had taught him that. His failed career had taught him that. 6 years of scraping by, of watching Sophie grow up in secondhand clothes, of working jobs that ground away his dignity one shift at a time, all of it had taught him the same lesson. People like him didn't get second chances. People like him didn't get to write their own endings. They got envelopes from men like Charles Langford and the illusion of choice when really there was none at all. But as Ethan carried a sleeping Sophie up 3 flights of stairs to their tiny apartment, as he tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead and whispered that everything would be okay, he couldn't quite let go of the image of Victoria's face, the shock in her eyes when she'd heard the song, the tears streaming down her perfect cheeks, the way she'd looked at him like he'd given her something precious and terrible all at once. For 16 years, Ethan had convinced himself that giving David credit for the song had been an act of love. His friend had been dying, his dreams cut short, and Ethan's one contribution had been to give him this one thing, a beautiful melody, a gift for the girl David loved, something that would outlive them both. But looking at Victoria tonight, seeing the pain that song had caused her, Ethan wondered if he'd been lying to himself all along. Maybe it hadn't been love. Maybe it had just been cowardice. And maybe, just maybe, the time for hiding was finally over. The resignation letter sat unsigned on Ethan's kitchen table for 3 days. He told himself he was being practical, that he needed time to line up another job before cutting off his only source of income. But the truth was harder to swallow. Every time he picked up the pen, his hand refused to move. Some stubborn part of him, the part that had survived the accident and Sophie's mother leaving and 6 years of grinding poverty, refused to let Charles Langford have the last word. Sophie noticed the change in him. She always did. "Daddy, you're not eating," she said on the 3rd morning, pushing her bowl of oatmeal across their small table toward him. "Mrs. Chen says breakfast is the most important meal." Ethan managed a smile. "Mrs. Chen is right, but I'm okay, Firefly. Just thinking." "About the piano?" His chest tightened. "Yeah, about the piano." Sophie was quiet for a moment, stirring her oatmeal into patterns. Then, without looking up, she asked, "Are you sad that I made you play it?" "No." The word came out fierce, immediate. Ethan reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "Sophie, listen to me. What happened that night wasn't your fault. None of it. You were just being you, hopeful and brave and believing that beautiful things should be shared. Don't ever apologize for that." "But that man gave you the envelope, and you've been worried ever since." 7 years old, and she saw too much. Ethan wondered what kind of childhood Sophie was having, always watching him, always trying to gauge his moods, always walking on eggshells around the edges of their barely stable life. She deserved better than this. "I'm worried about grown-up stuff," Ethan said gently. "Job stuff, money stuff. Nothing for you to carry, okay?" Sophie nodded, but her eyes said she didn't believe him. She went back to her oatmeal, and Ethan went back to staring at the resignation letter, and the morning passed in the same uneasy silence that had defined the last 3 days. The knock on the door came just after noon. Ethan wasn't expecting anyone. Their building didn't have a doorman, and most deliveries were left in the lobby. He opened the door cautiously, then froze. Victoria Langford stood in his hallway. She wore jeans and a simple black sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup that he could detect. Without the armor of her designer clothes and corporate polish, she looked younger, more human, and absolutely determined. "Mr. Hale," she said, "we need to talk." Ethan's mind raced. Behind him, Sophie had appeared in the doorway of their tiny living room, curiosity overcoming shyness. The apartment was a mess. Dishes in the sink, Sophie's homework scattered across the coffee table, the whole place smelling faintly of the cheap detergent Ethan used to stretch their laundry budget. "How did you find me?" he managed. "Employee records?" Victoria's gaze flicked past him to Sophie, and something softened in her expression. "Hello again?" "Hi," Sophie said quietly. "Ms. Langford, this isn't a good time," Ethan started, but Victoria was already shaking her head. "There's never going to be a good time for this conversation, so we might as well have it now." She looked at him steadily. "Please, I'm not here to threaten you. I just need to understand." Ethan hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to close the door, to protect what little he had left. But something in Victoria's face stopped him. The same desperate need for truth he'd seen at the party, only deeper now, more raw. "Give me a minute," he said. He closed the door, turned to Sophie. "Firefly, can you play in your room for a little bit? I need to talk to the lady from the party." "Is she angry about the piano?" "No, she just has questions." Sophie studied him with those two old eyes, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but call me if you need me." "I will. I promise." When Sophie had disappeared into her room, Ethan opened the door again. Victoria was still waiting, her expression unreadable. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Victoria entered the apartment like she was stepping onto foreign soil, cautious, observant, taking in every detail. Ethan saw it through her eyes, the threadbare furniture from thrift stores, the carefully patched curtains, the whole space maybe a quarter the size of her office. This was what failure looked like. What happened to people who reached for more than they deserved? "Can I get you something?" Ethan asked, falling back on manners he barely remembered. "Coffee? Water?" "No, thank you." Victoria turned to face him, and the vulnerability he'd glimpsed at the party was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of someone who'd built an empire through force of will. "I've spent the last 3 days trying to understand what happened at the party. I've listened to recordings of David's music, I've gone through every letter he wrote me that summer, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "Which is?" "That you're lying about where you learned that song." The words hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Ethan could have protested, could have stuck to his story, but standing in his own apartment, stripped of all pretense, he found he didn't have the energy for more lies. "Why does it matter?" he asked instead. "It's just a song." "It's not just a song." Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "David wrote that for me, the summer before he died. It was the last thing he gave me, and it was unfinished. He said he couldn't find the right ending, that something was missing. Maybe he found it before he died." "No." Victoria moved closer, her eyes searching his face. "I was with him the day before the accident. We spent hours talking about that song. He was frustrated because he couldn't make the second movement work. The bridge was wrong, he said. It didn't flow. People can figure things out overnight. Not David. He was methodical, careful. Every composition took him months." Victoria stopped directly in front of Ethan, close enough that he could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the strain around her mouth. "But you played it like you'd written it yourself, like every note was burned into your soul. So I'll ask you one more time. Where did you really learn that song?" The truth sat on Ethan's tongue, heavy and impossible. He could tell her. He could explain about the summer camp, about being 17 and invisible, about writing music in the early morning hours when everyone else was asleep, about giving it to David because his friend was dying and needed something beautiful to leave behind. But saying it out loud would mean admitting everything else. The accident that had ended his career. The choices he'd made out of pride and fear. The 6 years he'd spent running from who he used to be. "I can't," Ethan said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I can't tell you what you want to know." Victoria's expression hardened. "Can't or won't? Does it matter?" "Yes. Because if you can't tell me, that's one thing. But if you're choosing not to, if you're protecting someone or hiding something..." She stopped, frustration bleeding into her voice. "That song was the last piece of David I had left. For 16 years, I've believed it was his gift to me, his way of saying goodbye. And now you show up and play it better than he ever did, with movements he never wrote, and you won't tell me why." "I'm protecting myself," Ethan admitted, "and my daughter, that's all." "From what? From me?" "From the truth." The words came out harder than he intended. "From a past I can't afford to revisit. From questions that don't have good answers." Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she sat down on his worn couch, her perfect posture sagging slightly. "I loved him, you know, David. Not the way he loved me. I was too young, too confused, too wrapped up in my father's expectations. But he was the only person who ever saw me as something other than Charles Langford's daughter, the only person who didn't want something from me." Ethan remained standing, his back against the wall. "I know." "Do you? Because if you knew David, really knew him, you'd understand why this matters so much. He died believing I didn't love him back. He died thinking he wasn't good enough for me. And that song, that beautiful, heartbreaking song, was supposed to be his proof that he was wrong, that he was talented and special and worthy." "He was all those things," Ethan said softly. "But he never got to know it." Victoria looked up at him, and there were tears in her eyes now. "So when I hear that song, when I think about him sitting at a piano trying to perfect it for me, that's all I have. His memory, his music. And you're telling me even that might be a lie?" The accusation hung in the air, brutal and justified. Ethan felt something crack inside him, the careful walls he'd built around that summer starting to crumble. "It's not a lie," he said. "David did write it for you. Every note of that first movement was meant to tell you how he felt. But he didn't write it alone." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Victoria went very still, her eyes locked on his face. "What does that mean?" Ethan pushed off the wall, pacing to the window that overlooked the alley behind their building. Below, a couple fought next to the dumpsters, their voices carrying in the cold air. Real life. Messy and complicated, and nothing like the fairy tales people told themselves. "David and I were roommates at camp," Ethan began, his voice low. "We were both 17, both scholarship kids, both there because we were good enough to earn our way into a world that didn't want us." "I remember the scholarship students," Victoria said quietly. "David said they were treated like second-class citizens." "We were. The rich kids had better rooms, better instruments, better everything, and they made sure we knew it." Ethan kept his eyes on the window. "David handled it better than I did. He was charismatic, talented, confident. People liked him. I was just the weird kid who stayed up too late practicing." "How does this connect to the song?" "I'm getting there." Ethan took a breath. "David saw you the first week of camp. You were visiting someone, one of the teachers, I think. He watched you walk across the quad, and when you were gone, he said he'd just seen the most beautiful girl in the world." Victoria's breath hitched. "He told me it was love at first sight." "It was, for him." Ethan turned back to face her. "He spent the whole summer trying to get your attention, writing you notes, showing up wherever you were. And you were kind to him, which made it worse. Because David wasn't stupid. He knew the difference between kindness and interest." "I was 17 and confused," Victoria said defensively. "My father had my entire life planned out. David was..." "Not part of the plan," Ethan finished. "I know, David knew too. But he couldn't help himself. So he decided to write you a song. Something that would make you understand what he couldn't say. The melody." "Yeah, the melody." Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. He worked on it for weeks, but he couldn't get it right. The structure was there, the emotion was there, but something was missing. The bridge wouldn't resolve. The harmonies were wrong. He stayed up night after night trying to fix it, getting more and more frustrated. Victoria leaned forward. What happened? I helped him. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked almost like betrayal. You wrote the bridge, she said slowly. The modulation I noticed. The part David could never figure out. I wrote the bridge. I wrote the second movement. I wrote the ending. Ethan's voice was flat, matter of fact. David had the idea, the initial melody, the emotional core, but I'm the one who made it work. I'm the one who turned his feelings into something complete. Why? Victoria stood up, her voice rising. Why would you do that and then let everyone believe it was his? Because he was dying! The words exploded out of Ethan, all the guilt and grief he'd been carrying for 16 years finally breaking free. He was diagnosed 2 weeks before the accident. Leukemia. Aggressive, fast-moving. The doctors gave him maybe a year. He came to me the night he found out, and he was destroyed. Not because he was dying, he'd almost made peace with that, but because he was going to die without ever telling you how he felt, without ever creating something that proved his life mattered. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. I didn't know. He never told me he was sick. No one knew except me and his parents. He made them promise to keep it quiet. He didn't want pity. Ethan's voice cracked. So I gave him the song. I told him it was his, that I'd just helped a little. I let him believe he'd created something beautiful because he deserved that. He deserved to die knowing he'd left something of value behind. But the accident happened before the leukemia could kill him. Maybe that was mercy. I don't know. Ethan looked down at his hands, at the scars on his fingers from his own accident years later. What I do know is that David died believing he'd written something worthy of you, and I wasn't going to take that away from him. Not then, not ever. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria stood in the middle of his living room, her perfect composure completely shattered, tears streaming down her face. You let me mourn a lie, she whispered. For 16 years, I've carried that song like it was David's last words to me. I've listened to it and cried over it and believed it was his way of saying goodbye. And all this time, it was you? It was both of us, Ethan insisted. David's heart, my hands, that's the truth. No, the truth is you lied. You let me build a shrine to something that never existed. I let you remember your friend as someone who loved you enough to create beauty in your name. How is that wrong? Because it's not real. Victoria's voice broke completely. Nothing about it is real. David didn't write that ending. He didn't figure out the bridge. He didn't... She stopped, her whole body shaking. Who are you? Really? Ethan met her eyes. Someone who made a choice 16 years ago and has been living with the consequences ever since. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. Victoria wiped at her tears angrily. My father said you'd try to use this, to leverage it somehow. Was he right? Is that why you played it at the party? To get my attention? The accusation stung precisely because it was so wrong. I played it because my daughter asked me to. Because for 5 minutes, I wanted to remember who I used to be before everything fell apart. I didn't know you'd be there. I didn't know you'd recognize it. I certainly didn't plan any of this. But now that it's happened, what do you want? Nothing, Ethan said quietly. I want nothing from you except to be left alone. I don't believe you. I don't care. The words came out harsher than intended. Look around, Ms. Langford. Does this look like the home of someone angling for leverage? I'm a janitor living in a one-bedroom apartment with my daughter. I clean toilets for a living. Whatever you think I'm trying to get from you, I promise you're wrong. Victoria stared at him, her expression impossible to read. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My father gave you this. It was a copy of the resignation letter. Ethan's stomach dropped. He told me he'd handled the situation, Victoria continued, her voice cold, that the maintenance worker who'd caused a disruption had been dealt with, He said it with such satisfaction, like he'd solved a problem before it could become messy. He did solve it. I'm resigning. Have you signed it? Ethan hesitated. Not yet. Why not? Because I'm tired of running. Because I'm sick of letting men like your father dictate my life. Because for the first time in 6 years, I did something that mattered, and I'm not ready to apologize for it. I don't know, he said instead. Victoria looked at the paper in her hand, then at Ethan, then very deliberately tore it in half. Don't sign it. What? Don't sign it. She tore it again, the pieces falling to the floor like snow. Whatever my father threatened you with, whatever he promised or demanded, ignore it. You're not resigning. Ms. Langford, Victoria, if we're going to work together, you should call me Victoria. Ethan's head was spinning. Work together? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the truth. Victoria's expression hardened with determination. You say David's heart and your hands created that song. Fine. I want to know the whole story, every detail, every moment of that summer. I want to understand what really happened. Why does it matter? Because I spent 16 years in love with a ghost. The words burst out of her, raw and desperate. I built my entire life around the memory of a boy who saw me as more than my father's daughter. I made every decision asking myself what David would think, what he would want for me. And now you're telling me it was all based on a lie? Not a lie, just incomplete. Same thing. Victoria moved closer, her eyes blazing. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me everything about that summer, about the song, about why you gave it to David. And in return, I'm going to make sure my father doesn't destroy you. I don't need your protection. Yes, you do. Charles Langford doesn't make idle threats. If he told you to resign, he's already started laying groundwork to ensure you can't find work anywhere else. That's how he operates. He removes obstacles before they become problems. The words landed like punches. Ethan thought about the job applications he'd submitted over the years, the interviews that had gone well until someone checked his references. He'd always assumed it was the accident, the gap in his resume, his lack of formal education. But maybe it had been more than that. What do you want from me? He asked quietly. I want to understand. Victoria's voice softened. I want to know who David really was, beyond the perfect memory I've been carrying. I want to know who you are and why you disappeared after giving away something so valuable. I want... She stopped, her breath catching. When she continued, her voice was barely a whisper. I want to know if anything I've built my life on is real. Ethan looked at this woman standing in his shabby apartment, the CEO who had everything and nothing, and saw something he recognized. The same desperate need for truth he'd been running from. The same fear that maybe everything they'd believed about themselves was wrong. If I tell you, he said slowly, there's no going back. You can't unhear it. You can't unknow it. I understand. And it won't change anything. David still died. I'm still a janitor. The song is still out there with his name on it. I don't care about the song's authorship. I care about understanding what really happened. Victoria met his eyes. Please, I need to know. From Sophie's room came the sound of singing, his daughter's clear voice working through a melody Ethan had taught her last week. The sound was pure, untainted by the complicated adult world of lies and consequences. Ethan thought about the resignation letter in pieces on his floor, about Charles Langford's threats, about the song that had haunted him for 16 years, about the choice he'd made at 17 that had defined every moment since. Maybe Victoria was right. Maybe it was time to stop running from the truth. Okay, he said. I'll tell you everything. Victoria sat back down on the couch, her posture rigid with anticipation. Ethan remained standing by the window, gathering the threads of a story he'd spent 16 years trying to forget. The summer music camp was in upstate New York, he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Meadowbrook Academy. 6 weeks of intensive training for high school musicians. Most of the kids came from money, parents who could afford the $15,000 tuition. David and I were there on full scholarships. David mentioned the camp, Victoria said quietly. He said it changed his life. It did, just not the way anyone expected. Ethan turned from the window, meeting her eyes. The first day, they separated us into groups based on skill level. David was placed in the advanced composition track. I was put in remedial theory because I couldn't read music well enough. You couldn't read music? I was self-taught, learned everything by ear from an old keyboard my grandmother gave me. I could play anything I heard, compose original pieces in my head, but put sheet music in front of me and I was lost. The memory still stung after all these years. The other scholarship kids at least had school music programs. I had nothing, just 10 years of teaching myself in a basement apartment while my mom worked 3 jobs. Victoria's expression softened. That must have been isolating. It was worse than that. It was humiliating. Ethan crossed his arms, the defensive gesture automatic. Every day, I sat in classes with kids half my skill level, learning concepts I already understood but couldn't articulate properly. Meanwhile, David was thriving, making friends, impressing teachers, getting invited to all the social events I wasn't even told about. But you were friends. Eventually. He found me one night about 2 weeks in, practicing in one of the empty studios at 3 in the morning. I thought I was alone, but he'd heard the music from his dorm room and came to investigate. Ethan's voice softened at the memory. He stood in the doorway for maybe 20 minutes, just listening. When I finally noticed him, I expected him to mock me or report me for being out after curfew. Instead, he asked who I was playing. What did you tell him? The truth. That it was mine. Something I'd written the night before. Ethan moved to the small chair across from Victoria, finally sitting. David asked if I could play it again, so I did. And when I finished, he said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Then he asked why I wasn't in the advanced program. Victoria leaned forward. What did you say? I showed him my theory homework. All the mistakes, all the concepts I couldn't grasp when they were written down. David looked at it for maybe 30 seconds, then said the system was broken. That music theory was just language, and language could be learned. But what I had, the ability to hear music in my head and translate it to the keys, that was gift. That couldn't be taught. He was right. Maybe. But it didn't change anything. I was still in remedial classes, still treated like I didn't belong. Ethan paused, the old resentment rising despite the years. David tried to help. He'd sneak me into the advanced lectures, teach me theory in the evenings, even convinced one of the instructors to let me audit his composition seminar. But it wasn't enough. The other students knew I was scholarship. They knew I was poor. And in a place like Meadowbrook, that was all that mattered. Victoria's jaw tightened. I saw some of that. When I visited my piano teacher there, I noticed how the staff treated certain students differently. Your piano teacher was Professor Matthews? Yes. How did you? She was the only instructor who didn't treat me like I was wasting her time. Ethan's expression turned distant. She heard me play once, by accident, and afterward she told me I had something rare, something that couldn't be measured by grades or theory exams. But she also said I'd have to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously, because the world wasn't fair to people like me. She told me something similar, Victoria admitted, about being a woman in a male-dominated industry. That excellence wouldn't be enough. I'd have to be flawless. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Ethan saw the connection David must have recognized all those years ago. Victoria Langford wasn't just beautiful. She was someone who understood what it meant to be judged by circumstances beyond your control. When did you see her? Ethan asked. Victoria, I mean. When did David first notice you? It was the 3rd week of camp. I came to watch Professor Matthews' student recital. Victoria's voice grew softer. David performed a Bach prelude. He was brilliant, technically perfect, emotionally resonant. Afterward, I went to congratulate him, and he looked at me like I'd handed him the sun. He came back to our room that night and couldn't stop talking about you, Ethan said. Your smile, your voice, the way you'd really listen to his performance instead of just offering polite praise. He said you were different from everyone else, that you saw him as a musician, not just another scholarship kid. I did see him that way. David was extraordinarily talented, and you were extraordinarily kind. For a boy who'd spent his whole life being invisible, that kindness was everything. Ethan's hands clenched on the armrests. He asked me to help him write something for you, a piece that would make you understand how he felt. I told him he should do it himself, that his own composition would mean more. But he insisted. He said I understood music in a way he didn't, that I could hear things he couldn't. So you agreed? Not at first. I knew it was a bad idea, writing music for someone else, letting David take credit for my work. But he wore me down. Every night he'd come back from seeing you, from those brief conversations you probably don't even remember, and he'd be so full of hope and desperation. He loved you, Victoria. Completely. Hopelessly. Victoria's eyes glistened. I knew he cared for me, but love, we barely knew each other. Love doesn't require time when you're 17, Ethan said. It just requires possibility. And you represented everything David wanted to believe about himself, that he was worthy, that he mattered, that someone like you could see value in someone like him. The words hung heavy in the air. Victoria wiped at her eyes, composing herself before speaking. Tell me about writing the song. Ethan stood, needing movement to continue. David had the initial melody. He'd wake up humming it, play fragments of it between classes. It was good, raw and honest and full of longing. But it was incomplete. He couldn't develop it, couldn't build the structure it needed to become a full piece. So you helped. I tried. We'd meet in the practice studios after midnight, when everyone else was asleep. David would play his melody and I'd experiment with harmonies, trying to find what came next. But nothing worked. Every direction I took, it felt wrong, too complicated, too simple, not honest enough. Victoria stood as well, moving closer. What changed? You did. Ethan's voice dropped. One night, about a week before camp ended, David came back destroyed. You told him about your father's expectations, about the business program you were enrolled in, about the future that had been planned for you since childhood. David realized you weren't free to choose your own path, much less choose someone like him. I remember that conversation, Victoria whispered. He asked if I ever wanted something different, and I told him wanting didn't matter. That duty came first. He cried that night. I'd never seen him cry before. Ethan's chest tightened at the memory. He said he understood now. That loving you meant accepting he could never have you. That the only thing he could give you was this song, proof that you'd inspired something beautiful, even if you'd never be his. That's when you wrote it. That's when I understood it. Ethan turned to face her fully. The melody wasn't about winning you or changing your mind. It was about bearing witness to something precious, even as it slipped away. It was about honoring love without demanding it be returned. Once I understood that, the rest came easily. The bridge, Victoria said. The modulation from E minor to G major. That was the breakthrough. Yes. The shift from sorrow to acceptance, from longing to grace. Ethan's voice grew quiet. I wrote it in one sitting, barely sleeping, the music pouring out like it had been waiting inside me for years. The second movement, the resolution, the ending. David could never find. It all crystallized because I finally understood what the song needed to say. Which was? That love isn't about possession. It's about transformation. David loved you enough to accept he'd never have you. That kind of love is rare. It changes you. It makes you better than you were. Tears streamed freely down Victoria's face now. He really felt that way? He did. And when I showed him what I'd written, he said it was perfect, that it expressed everything he couldn't put into words. Ethan's voice cracked. So I gave it to him. I told him it was his now, his gift to you. I made him promise not to tell anyone I'd helped, because the song needed to be completely his for it to matter. But you wrote most of it. I translated what he felt into music. That's not the same as creating the feeling. Ethan met her eyes steadily. David's love was real, Victoria. The song came from that love. I was just the instrument that gave it voice. Victoria absorbed this, her expression cycling through grief and understanding in something that might have been anger. And then he died. 2 weeks later, the car accident on his way home from camp, Ethan's hands trembled. I was supposed to be in that car. David had offered me a ride home. My bus didn't leave until the next day. But my mom called that morning, said she'd found work that started immediately, so I needed to come home early. I took a different bus. 6 hours later, David's parents called to tell me he was gone. You blame yourself. I blame the universe for being random and cruel. David was good and talented and deserved decades to create beautiful things. Instead, he got 17 years and a drunk driver who ran a red light. The silence that followed was absolute. Through the thin walls, they could hear Sophie singing, her innocent voice a stark contrast to the weight of the conversation. After the funeral, Ethan continued, David's mother gave me something, a letter David had written the night before he died. He must have sensed something, had some premonition, because he wrote letters to everyone important in his life. What did it say? That if anything happened to him, I should make sure you got the song. That it was his last gift to you, his way of saying goodbye. Ethan's voice hardened, and it said I should never tell anyone I'd helped write it, that the song needed to be completely his for it to mean what it was supposed to mean. Victoria's breath caught. He knew. He knew he was dying. From the leukemia diagnosis, yes. The accident just beat the disease to it. Ethan moved to the window again, needing distance. So I honored his wishes. I gave the recording to Professor Matthews, told her it was David's final composition for you. She made sure you got it. And I never said a word about my involvement. For 16 years. For 16 years, Ethan confirmed. I went to college on a music scholarship, studied composition, started building a career. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that David's memory deserved that sacrifice. But the truth was more complicated. Victoria moved to stand beside him at the window. What truth? That giving away that song broke something in me. The admission cost him, but Ethan forced it out anyway. It was the best thing I'd ever written, the purest expression of everything I understood about music and emotion and the human heart, and I'd given it away to honor a dead friend's memory. Every time I tried to write something new, I compared it to that song and found it lacking. Every competition, every commission, every opportunity, I'd freeze, remembering what I'd lost. You had writer's block. I had guilt. Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the window. Guilt for resenting David's memory. Guilt for wishing I'd kept the song. Guilt for being alive when he was dead. It poisoned everything. Victoria's hand found his arm, the touch gentle but grounding. What happened to your career? I graduated, got accepted into a prestigious master's program, started teaching on the side to pay bills. For a while, I thought I could push through it. I had technique, theory, understanding. Surely that was enough. Ethan's laugh was bitter. Then I met Sophie's mother, Claire. She was a dancer, vibrant and full of life, everything I wasn't. We got married too young, had Sophie too soon. The financial pressure mounted. I started taking session work, playing piano for commercial jingles and background music. Anything to pay the rent. That's not failure, Ethan. That's survival. It felt like failure, especially when Claire started resenting me for not being the artist she'd fallen in love with. I'd come home exhausted from recording the same 30-second loop 50 times, and she'd ask when I was going to write something real, something that mattered. The memory still stung. I didn't have an answer. I'd given my one real composition away, and everything after was just noise. Victoria's grip on his arm tightened. Is that when the accident happened? 6 years ago. I was driving home from a session, exhausted, not paying attention, swerved to avoid a dog in the road and hit a telephone pole. Ethan held up his right hand, showing the scars that crisscrossed his fingers. Shattered my hand in 17 places. 3 surgeries, months of physical therapy. The doctor said I was lucky to have any function at all. But you can still play. I heard you at the party. I can play, but not like before. The dexterity is gone, the speed, the precision required for professional work. Ethan lowered his hand. Session musicians need to be perfect. I wasn't perfect anymore, so the work dried up. Claire left. She said she couldn't watch me give up on myself. And suddenly I was a single father with a disabled hand and no viable career. So you became a janitor. I became whatever would keep Sophie fed and housed. Janitor, night security, warehouse work. Anything that didn't require the hand skills I'd lost. Ethan's voice hardened, and I buried the past, changed my name slightly, dropped all contact with the music world, raised my daughter in obscurity. It was safer that way, cleaner. Victoria turned him to face her, her gray eyes intense. Until I walked into that party and heard you play David's song. Your song, Ethan corrected. It was always yours, even if you didn't know it. Our song, Victoria said firmly. David's heart, your hands, my inspiration. That's the truth, isn't it? It belongs to all 3 of us. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie's door opened. She stood in the hallway, her expression uncertain. "Daddy, are you okay?" I heard voices. "I'm fine, Firefly." Ethan moved toward his daughter, needing the anchor of her presence. "Ms. Langford and I are just talking." Sophie looked at Victoria with those two observant eyes. "You're the lady who made Daddy sad at the party." Sophie. "No, she's right." Victoria crouched down to Sophie's level, her voice gentle. "I did make your father sad. I asked him questions about the past that hurt to answer. I'm sorry for that." Sophie studied her for a long moment. "Daddy says sorry only matters if you don't do it again." Despite everything, Ethan felt a smile tug at his lips. "That's what I say, yes." "Then I promise not to hurt him again," Victoria said solemnly, "if he'll give me the chance to make things right." Sophie looked at Ethan, silently asking for guidance. He nodded slightly, and Sophie turned back to Victoria. "Okay, but if you break your promise, I'll be very disappointed." "That's fair?" Victoria stood, something like wonder crossing her face. "You're very protective of your father." "Someone has to be," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "He works too hard and doesn't eat enough, and sometimes he gets sad late at night when he thinks I'm sleeping." Ethan's throat tightened. "Sophie, why don't you go finish your coloring? I'll make us lunch in a few minutes." "Can Ms. Langford stay for lunch?" The question caught both adults off guard. Victoria looked at Ethan, raising an eyebrow in question. "We don't have much," Ethan said. "Just grilled cheese and soup." "Grilled cheese sounds perfect," Victoria said softly. "If the invitation stands." Sophie beamed. "I'll set the table." She disappeared into the kitchen with the boundless energy of childhood, leaving the adults alone again. Ethan and Victoria stood in the small living room, the weight of everything said and unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Victoria spoke. "Your daughter is remarkable. She's everything to me." "I can see that." Victoria's expression turned serious again. "Ethan, I need to know, do you regret giving the song to David? Truly?" The question deserved honesty. Ethan considered it, really considered it, before answering. "I regret the circumstances that made me feel like I had to. I regret not fighting harder to keep my name on it. But giving it to David himself? No. He died believing he'd created something beautiful for you. That brought him peace. I can't regret giving him that." "Even though it cost you your career?" "Even though it complicated everything," Ethan corrected. "The career fell apart for a lot of reasons. The song was just one piece of a much bigger mess." Victoria moved closer, her voice dropping. "What if we could fix it? Not change the past, but acknowledge the truth moving forward." "What do you mean?" "I mean my father was wrong to threaten you. You don't owe anyone silence about your own work." Victoria's eyes flashed with determination. "What if we told the truth? Publicly. That the song was a collaboration between you and David, that you helped him create something beautiful because that's what friends do." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Victoria, no. That would destroy David's memory. People would think he was a fraud." "People would think he was human," Victoria countered. "Someone who had the wisdom to recognize talent and the humility to accept help. That's not fraud. That's collaboration. His parents would never forgive me." "Have you talked to them in 16 years?" The question landed like a blow. Ethan hadn't. After the funeral, after delivering the song, he disappeared from their lives as completely as he'd disappeared from the music world. "They deserve to remember their son as a genius," he said quietly. "They deserve to remember their son as he actually was. Talented, yes, but also generous enough to include others in his creative process." Victoria took his hand, her touch warm and steady. "Ethan, you've spent 16 years protecting everyone else. David's memory, his parents' grief, even my illusions about the past. When do you get to stop hiding?" "I'm not hiding, I'm surviving." "You're doing both." Victoria's grip tightened. "And I'm telling you that you don't have to anymore. Let me help you. Let me use the resources I have to set the record straight." "Why?" Ethan searched her face. "Why does this matter so much to you?" "Because I spent 16 years building my life around a lie," Victoria said fiercely. "I made every decision asking what David would want, what he would think, how I could honor his memory. I turned myself into Charles Langford's perfect daughter because I thought that's what David would have wanted. for me to be strong and successful and untouchable. Victoria. But it was never what I wanted, she continued, her voice breaking. I wanted to be free, to make my own choices, to be someone other than the Ice Queen of Sterling Industries. But I couldn't because I owed it to David's memory to be exceptional. Understanding dawned. And now you know David didn't write the song alone. Now I know David accepted help, that he collaborated, that he wasn't perfect, and perfection wasn't what made the song beautiful. Tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks. If he could do that, if he could be human and flawed and still create something meaningful, then maybe I can too. The words hung in the air between them, raw and desperate and achingly honest. Ethan saw Victoria clearly now, stripped of all corporate armor, just a woman who'd been carrying an impossible weight for far too long. From the kitchen came the clatter of plates as Sophie set the table, humming the melody Ethan had played at the party. The sound was pure and uncomplicated, a reminder that not everything had to be twisted by the past. If we do this, Ethan said slowly, if we tell the truth, there will be consequences. Your father will fight it. The media will twist it. David's memory will be complicated in ways his parents might not be ready for. I know. And it won't change my situation. I'm still a janitor with a disabled hand and a daughter to support. Recognition won't pay my bills. Then we'll deal with that too. Victoria's expression hardened with determination. Ethan, I run a multi-billion-dollar company. I think I can figure out how to help one talented composer get back on his feet. I don't want charity. Good, because I'm not offering it. I'm offering partnership. Victoria released his hand, her posture straightening into something that looked like the CEO she was. Sterling Industries has a foundation that supports emerging artists. What if we created a program for musicians who've faced setbacks? You could run it. Use your experience to help others who've had their careers interrupted. Ethan stared at her. You're serious? Completely. You know what it's like to have talent but not opportunity, to face obstacles that have nothing to do with skill. Who better to identify and support artists in similar situations? I'm not qualified. You're uniquely qualified, Victoria cut him off. And it would give you steady income while you rebuild your own music career if that's what you want. The offer was staggering, too generous, too perfect, too much like a dream that people like Ethan didn't get to have. Why? He asked again. Why are you doing this? Victoria's expression softened. Because David would have wanted me to. Not the perfect David I've been mourning, but the real David who helped his friend even when it cost him credit for the work. Because you gave him something precious when he needed it most, and turnabout is fair play, and because... She stopped, uncertainty flickering across her face for the first time since she'd arrived. Because, Ethan prompted. Because I'm tired of living in the past, Victoria said quietly. I'm tired of making every decision based on what I think I owe to a dead boy's memory. I want to move forward, and maybe helping you is part of that. Maybe it's how I finally let David rest. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie appeared in the doorway. Lunch is ready. I made 3 places. The simple announcement broke the tension. Victoria smiled, genuine warmth reaching her eyes. Then we shouldn't keep the chef waiting. They moved into the tiny kitchen, where Sophie had indeed set 3 places at the small table. The plates didn't match, the glasses were mismatched, and the table itself wobbled on uneven legs. But Sophie had tried to make it nice, folding paper napkins into triangles and putting out the one non-chipped butter dish they owned. Ethan made grilled cheese while Victoria and Sophie talked about everything and nothing, school, favorite colors, the best way to build a snowman. It was surreal, watching this billionaire CEO sitting at his discount store table, listening with genuine interest as his 7-year-old explained the complex social dynamics of 2nd grade. And then Marcus said my shoes were ugly, Sophie was saying, but I told him they were perfectly good shoes and he should mind his own business. Good for you, Victoria said firmly. No one should make you feel bad about things that don't matter. That's what Daddy says too, Sophie beamed at him. He says people who judge you for having less money are people whose opinions don't count. Ethan set plates of golden brown grilled cheese in front of them, his ears burning. Eat your lunch, Firefly. As they ate, Victoria praising the perfectly melted cheese with the same seriousness she probably used for boardroom negotiations. Ethan felt something shift inside him. This moment, ordinary and strange and somehow right, felt like a turning point he hadn't known he needed. Maybe hiding wasn't the same as surviving after all. Maybe it was time to stop running from who he used to be and start building who he could become. And maybe, just maybe, Victoria Langford showing up in his apartment wasn't a disaster, but an opportunity. Not just for himself, but for both of them to finally step out of David Chen's shadow and into their own light. The call came 3 days later, just as Ethan was walking Sophie to school through the morning cold. His phone buzzed with an unknown number, and something told him to answer. "Mr. Hale, this is Margaret Chen, David's mother." Ethan stopped walking so abruptly that Sophie stumbled. He steadied her with one hand while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Mrs. Chen? Hello?" "Victoria Langford contacted me yesterday." Margaret's voice was steady, controlled in the way of someone who'd had 16 years to master grief. "She told me an interesting story about a song I thought I understood." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Mrs. Chen, I can explain." "Can you?" "Because I spent last night going through David's journals from that summer, the ones I couldn't bear to read after he died. And do you know what I found? Entries about his roommate, a boy named Ethan who played piano at 3 in the morning, a boy who helped him with theory homework, a boy who, according to David's own words, understands music the way most people understand breathing." Margaret paused. "He wrote about you constantly, Mr. Hale, about your talent, about how the school was wasting it, about how he wished you'd take credit for the things you created." Ethan couldn't speak. Sophie tugged at his hand, confused by the sudden stop, but he barely felt it. "The last entry was dated 2 days before the accident," Margaret continued. "David wrote that you'd helped him finish the song for Victoria, that you'd given him the ending he couldn't find. He wrote that he knew it was wrong to take credit for your work, but that you'd insisted. He wrote that if anything happened to him, he hoped someday you'd claim what was yours." "Mrs. Chen, I never wanted—" "I know what you wanted. You wanted to give my dying son one last moment of pride. One last accomplishment to hold on to before the leukemia or the universe or whatever cruel fate was waiting took him away." Her voice cracked slightly. "And you succeeded. David died believing he'd created something beautiful. You gave him that gift." Tears burned Ethan's eyes. "I'm sorry. I should have told you years ago." "Why? So I could carry the truth alone? So I could know my son's last composition wasn't entirely his?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "No, Mr. Hale. You did the right thing. For David, for me, even for yourself, though I suspect you've paid for that kindness in ways I'll never fully understand." "Then why are you calling?" "Because Victoria Langford asked my permission to set the record straight, to publicly acknowledge your contribution to the song, and I wanted to tell you myself that you have it." Ethan leaned against a building, his legs suddenly weak. Sophie pressed close to his side, her small hand warm in his. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say you'll stop hiding," Margaret said firmly. "David spent his last week celebrating your talent. Don't let his faith in you be wasted. Don't let the music die with him." The words landed like a benediction and a command all at once. Ethan wiped at his eyes, aware of Sophie watching him with concern. "Mrs. Chen, did you know about the leukemia diagnosis?" "Not until after the accident. He made the doctors promise not to tell us until he was ready. He wanted one last summer where we didn't look at him like he was dying." Her voice softened. "He wanted to be David the musician, not David the cancer patient. You helped him be that person. You have no idea what that meant to us." They talked for a few more minutes, Margaret sharing memories of David that Ethan had never heard, Ethan offering his own. When they finally said goodbye, Ethan stood on the cold sidewalk feeling lighter than he had in 16 years. "Daddy, who was that?" Sophie asked as they resumed walking. "An old friend's mother. Someone I should have talked to a long time ago." "Did it make you happy or sad?" Ethan considered the question. "Both, but maybe more happy than sad." Sophie squeezed his hand. "Good. You deserve happy." The simple declaration nearly broke him. Ethan crouched down, pulling his daughter into a fierce hug. "When did you get so wise, Firefly?" I'm 7, Sophie said seriously. That's pretty old. Despite everything, Ethan laughed. He kissed her forehead, stood, and they continued toward school. But the conversation with Margaret Chen had shifted something fundamental inside him. Permission. He'd been waiting for permission to stop hiding, and now he had it. The question was what to do with it. The answer came faster than expected. That afternoon, while Ethan was at the building's main office turning in paperwork, Victoria appeared with a man in an expensive suit and a leather portfolio. "Ethan, this is James Mitchell," she said without preamble. "My attorney. We need to talk." The meeting took place in a Sterling Industries conference room on the 20th floor, far below the executive suites where the party had been, but still worlds above Ethan's maintenance closet. James spread documents across the polished table while Victoria stood by the window, her posture radiating controlled energy. "Ms. Langford has outlined a proposal," James began, his tone professionally neutral. "Before we proceed, I need to ensure you understand the implications." "What kind of implications?" Ethan asked warily. "Legal, financial, and reputational." James pushed a document toward him. "Ms. Langford wishes to establish a foundation in David Chen's name, focused on supporting musicians who've faced career interruptions. She wants you to direct it." Ethan stared at the document. "She mentioned something like that, but this is real?" "Extremely real. The Sterling Foundation will seed it with $5 million initially, with annual budgets to be determined by board approval." James tapped another document. "This would be your employment contract. Salary, benefits, discretionary funding for your own musical pursuits, all contingent on 2 conditions. Which are? First, that you publicly acknowledge your contribution to the composition known as Victoria's Song." James glanced at Victoria, who nodded. "Second, that you agree to perform the complete piece, including your extended movements, at a public memorial concert for David Chen." Ethan's hands trembled. "A memorial concert?" "David deserved better than a funeral where half the attendees didn't know his name," Victoria said quietly, turning from the window. "He deserved celebration, recognition, and now that I know the truth about the song, I want to honor both of you properly." "Victoria, I can't perform publicly." "My hand can do more than you think," she interrupted. "I heard you play at the party, Ethan. You were extraordinary. I made mistakes, technical errors that any trained musician would catch. And you also made magic." Victoria moved to the table, her eyes intense. "Do you know what people said about that performance? Not about the technical precision, but about the emotion, the honesty. One board member told me it was the most moving thing he'd heard in 30 years of attending concerts. He was being polite. He was being truthful." Victoria sat down across from him. "Ethan, I've attended hundreds of performances by technically perfect musicians who couldn't make me feel a single thing. You played with mistakes and made grown men cry. That's not a flaw. That's gift." James cleared his throat. "There's also the matter of intellectual property rights. Ms. Langford has asked me to draw up an agreement that would formally recognize you as co-composer of the work, with appropriate royalties and credits." "Royalties?" Ethan's head was spinning. "The song has royalties?" "It's been licensed for use in several films and commercials over the years," James explained. "The Chen estate has received modest payments. Going forward, those would be split between the estate and yourself." "I can't take money from David's family." "You can and you will," Victoria said firmly. Margaret Chen insisted. She said David would have wanted you to benefit from your own work. Ethan looked at the documents spread before him: contracts, agreements, financial projections. It was everything he'd given up 16 years ago, offered back to him like a gift he didn't deserve. "Why?" he asked Victoria. "Why are you doing all this?" She met his eyes steadily. "Because you were right. About the song belonging to all 3 of us. About collaboration being valuable. About truth mattering more than perfect narratives." She paused. "And because my father tried to erase you, and I will not let Charles Langford dictate who gets to be seen." The steel in her voice was unmistakable. Ethan remembered the resignation letter, the threats, the envelope full of hush money. "He's going to fight this," Ethan said. "Your father. He won't let you help me without a battle." "Then we'll battle." Victoria's expression hardened. I'm done letting him control my life. Done letting him decide what's acceptable and what isn't. If he wants a war over this, he'll get one. James shifted uncomfortably. Miss Langford, perhaps we should discuss strategy before. The strategy is simple, Victoria cut him off. We tell the truth. Publicly. Completely. We announce the foundation, the memorial concert, and Ethan's role in creating the song. We do it in a way that celebrates David's memory while acknowledging the collaboration. And we dare my father to dispute it. He'll claim conflict of interest, James warned. He'll say you're being manipulated by someone seeking financial gain. Let him. I have Margaret Chen's blessing and David's own journals documenting the collaboration. What does he have? Assumptions and prejudice. The conviction in Victoria's voice was absolute. Ethan saw the woman who'd built an empire in her father's shadow, who'd closed billion-dollar deals and faced down hostile boards. But he also saw something else. Fear, carefully hidden, but present nonetheless. What will this cost you? He asked quietly. Really cost you, I mean, with your father, your company, your fiancé. Victoria's jaw tightened. Marcus and I broke up yesterday. The confession landed like a thunderclap. James blinked in surprise, clearly unaware. Ethan leaned forward. Because of this? Because of everything this represents. Victoria's voice wavered slightly. When I told Marcus what I'd learned about the song, he said I was being irrational, that it didn't matter who wrote what, that I should leave the past alone and focus on the merger. When I said I was going to help you, he said I was risking my reputation for someone who didn't deserve it. He's not entirely wrong, Ethan said. He's completely wrong. Victoria's eyes flashed. You know what he said when I told him about the foundation? He said it was a waste of resources, that supporting failed musicians was throwing good money after bad. He actually used those words. Failed musicians. Like you, like David. Like anyone who'd faced obstacles was automatically worthless. The hurt in her voice was palpable. Ethan understood then that this wasn't just about him or David or the song. This was Victoria drawing a line, choosing a path that led away from everything she'd been raised to value. I'm sorry, he said, about Marcus. I'm not. The engagement was another one of my father's plans. Marcus Ashford, media empire, perfect merger of power and influence. Victoria laughed bitterly. I said yes because David would have wanted me to be practical. Except David never would have wanted that. The real David. The one who collaborated and asked for help and died before he could learn to stop living for other people's expectations. James was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone realizing he was witnessing something more complex than a business transaction. Ms. Langford, he said gently, perhaps you should take some time before making such significant decisions. The foundation can wait. The concert can wait. You're under considerable emotional strain. I'm under considerable clarity, Victoria corrected. For the first time in 16 years, I'm making a decision based on what I want, not what I think I owe to the past or my father's vision or corporate optics. And what I want is to help Ethan Hale get his life back. The declaration hung in the air. Ethan felt the weight of it, the responsibility, and the risk. He could say no. He could walk away from all of it. The foundation, the contract, the public acknowledgement. He could go back to his maintenance job and his quiet life and never have to face the exposure that truth would bring. But Sophie's voice echoed in his mind. You deserve happy. All right, Ethan heard himself say. I'll do it. The foundation, the concert, all of it, on one condition. Victoria leaned forward. Name it. Sophie comes first, always. Any decision that affects her well-being, any publicity that might impact her, any risk to her stability, I walk away. No negotiation. Agreed, Victoria said immediately. We'll have provisions in the contract protecting her privacy. James can draft them today. James nodded, already making notes. I'll include media restrictions, school privacy guarantees, and veto power over any public appearances involving your daughter. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Then let's do this. Let's tell the truth. The press conference was scheduled for the following week, but Charles Langford moved faster. Ethan was leaving Sophie's school the next afternoon when a black car pulled up alongside him. The The window rolled down, revealing Charles Langford's sharp features. "Mr. Hale, get in. We need to talk." Every instinct screamed at Ethan to refuse. But Sophie was safely inside at after-school care, and running from this conversation would only delay the inevitable. He got in the car. Charles waited until they were moving before speaking. "My daughter seems to have developed an unfortunate attachment to you." "We're working together on a foundation," Ethan said carefully. "That's all. Don't insult my intelligence. Victoria broke off her engagement, defied my direct orders, and is risking her reputation for a janitor with delusions of grandeur." Charles turned to face him fully. "So tell me, what exactly did you promise her? What fantasy are you selling?" "The truth. That's all." "The truth." Charles's laugh was cold. "The truth is that you're a failed musician who couldn't make it on talent alone, so now you're exploiting a dead boy's memory and my daughter's guilt to claw your way back into relevance." The words stung precisely because they echoed Ethan's own deepest fears. "I never asked Victoria for anything. She came to me. Because you manipulated her. You played that song knowing exactly what it would do to her. You've been planning this for years, haven't you? Waiting for the perfect moment to strike." "I've been trying to survive," Ethan shot back, anger finally breaking through. "I've been working 3 jobs to keep my daughter fed and housed. I've been living in obscurity because I gave away the best thing I ever created to honor a friend's dying wish. I haven't been planning anything except making it through each day." Charles studied him with cold appraisal. "You almost sound sincere." "I am sincere. I don't want your daughter's money. I don't want fame or recognition or revenge. I want to direct a foundation that helps musicians like me, people who have talent but got knocked down and need support getting back up. That's it." "Admirable," Charles said dryly, "except that getting back up requires millions of my company's dollars and my daughter's credibility. You'll forgive me if I'm skeptical about your motives." The car had stopped. Ethan looked out the window and realized they were in front of his apartment building. Charles had known exactly where he lived. "Here's what's going to happen," Charles continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You're going to call Victoria and tell her you've reconsidered, that you appreciate her generosity, but you're not comfortable with the arrangement. You'll decline the foundation directorship, withdraw from the memorial concert, and sign an NDA agreeing never to publicly discuss your alleged contribution to David Chen's composition. And if I don't, then I'll destroy you." Charles's expression didn't change. "I'll file lawsuits claiming fraud and defamation. I'll have my investigators dig into every corner of your life until they find something. And trust me, Mr. Hale, everyone has something. I'll make sure you never work again, that your daughter's school knows exactly who her father is, that every door you try to open slams in your face." Ethan's blood ran cold. "You'd hurt a 7-year-old girl to get to me?" "I'd protect my daughter from a predator by any means necessary." Charles leaned closer. "You're a threat to Victoria's stability, to her position in the company, her reputation in the industry, her future. And I eliminate threats. Victoria is an adult. She makes her own choices. Victoria is emotionally compromised by guilt and nostalgia. She's making irrational decisions that will cost her everything she's built." Charles pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This is a check for $200,000. More than enough to relocate, start over somewhere else, give your daughter a better life. Take it and disappear. Or stay, and watch everything you care about burn." Ethan stared at the envelope, at this second attempt to buy his silence. The money would solve every immediate problem he had: rent, Sophie's education, breathing room to figure out what came next. It was more than he'd make in 5 years of maintenance work. It was also the price of his soul. "No," Ethan said quietly. Charles's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "No, I'm not taking your money. I'm not signing your NDA. I'm not disappearing." Ethan met his eyes steadily. "You want to threaten me? Go ahead. You want to destroy my life? I've already survived losing everything once. But I will not let you erase me again. I will not pretend I don't exist because it's convenient for you. You're making a grave mistake." "Maybe. But it's my mistake to make." Ethan reached for the door handle. "And for what it's worth, Mr. Langford, you should be proud of your daughter. She's choosing integrity over convenience. That's rare. That's valuable. And it came from her. Not from you. He got out of the car before Charles could respond, walking into his building without looking back. His hands were shaking, his heart racing, but something else was there too. A fierce satisfaction at finally standing his ground. Inside his apartment, Ethan collapsed onto the couch, adrenaline draining away. He'd just declared war on one of the most powerful men in New York, a man with unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. His phone buzzed. Victoria. "My father just called me," she said without preamble. "He's furious. What did you say to him?" "That I wasn't backing down, that I wasn't taking his money, that—" Ethan stopped. "Victoria, he threatened Sophie. Indirectly, but still. If we do this, if we move forward, it's going to get ugly." "I know." Victoria's voice was steel. "James is already preparing countermeasures. We'll have security for you and Sophie, legal protection, everything you need. My father makes threats, but he's also a businessman. He won't do anything that exposes him to legal liability." "You sound very sure." "I'm very determined. There's a difference." Victoria paused. "Ethan, if you want to walk away, I'll understand. I'll make sure you're protected either way, but if you're willing to see this through, I promise you won't face it alone." Ethan thought about David's journals, about Margaret Chen's blessing, about Sophie saying he deserved happy. He thought about 16 years of hiding and how exhausting it had been to pretend he was less than he was. "I'm seeing it through," he said. "Whatever comes." "Good." Victoria's relief was audible. "Then let's get to work. The press conference is in 5 days. We need to prepare you for what's coming." What came was a whirlwind. James drafted contracts and protection orders. A PR firm Victoria hired coached Ethan on media responses. Margaret Chen flew in from California, bringing David's journals and her blessing in person. A security detail appeared at Sophie's school, discreet but thorough. And through it all, Victoria was there, constant, supportive, refusing to let Ethan's doubt derail the momentum. "You're doing this for me," Ethan said during one late-night strategy session. "More than for David or the foundation or the truth. You're fighting your father because I gave you a reason to." Victoria looked up from the speech she was reviewing. "Is that a problem?" "It's a lot of responsibility. What if I'm not worth it?" She set down the papers, her expression softening. "Ethan, do you know what I saw when you played that song at the party? Not just talent or technique or even the music itself. I saw someone who'd survived 16 years carrying an impossible burden and still managed to create beauty. Someone who chose honor over recognition and love over ambition. Someone who reminded me that there are things more important than my father's approval. I'm not that noble." "You're noble enough," Victoria smiled. "Besides, you're giving me something far more valuable than you realize. You're giving me permission to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to choose what I want instead of what I think I should want. That's worth fighting for." The press conference was held at Sterling Industries headquarters, in the same ballroom where Ethan had played the piano. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. Reporters packed the room, cameras ready, questions prepared. At the front, a small stage held 3 chairs, one for Victoria, one for Margaret Chen, and one for Ethan. Sophie sat in the front row with Mrs. Chen from the grocery store, who'd agreed to watch her. Ethan had debated bringing her, but Sophie had insisted. "I want to see you be brave, Daddy," she'd said. So here they were. Victoria spoke first, her voice clear and confident. She explained the foundation, its mission, its funding. She talked about David Chen's talent and generosity, and then she told the truth about the song. "For 16 years," she said, looking directly at the cameras, "I believed Victoria's song was composed entirely by David Chen. I was wrong. The piece was a collaboration between David and Ethan Hale, the man sitting beside me. Ethan wrote the majority of the composition, but he gave David credit because that's what David needed at the end of his life. Today, we're setting the record straight, not to diminish David's memory, but to honor the truth he would have wanted told." The room erupted with questions. Victoria fielded them calmly, then turned to Margaret Chen. David's mother spoke about her son's journals, about his admiration for Ethan, about his wish that Ethan would someday claim his work. She spoke with the authority of grief transmuted into grace, and the room grew quiet, listening. Then it was Ethan's turn. He stood, his legs unsteady, and approached the microphone. Sophie gave him a thumbs up from the front row, and that small gesture steadied him. "My name is Ethan Hale," he began. 16 years ago, I made a choice to give away the best thing I'd ever created. I told myself it was noble, that it honored my friend. But the truth is more complicated. I gave it away because I was 17 and scared, and convinced that people like me didn't deserve recognition. I'm here today because I'm done hiding, done pretending I'm less than I am, done letting fear dictate my choices. He looked at Victoria, at Margaret, at Sophie. David Chen was my friend and my inspiration. The song belongs to both of us, his heart, my hands, and I'm grateful to finally say that out loud. The questions came fast and skeptical, but Ethan answered them honestly. Yes, he'd worked as a janitor. Yes, he'd had an accident that damaged his hand. Yes, he understood how this looked to people who doubted his motives. But he also spoke about survival, about resilience, about second chances and the courage it took to claim them. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Ethan realized he wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever happened next, whatever Charles Langford did, whatever the media made of this story, Ethan had told his truth. He'd stood up. He'd been seen. That was enough. The backlash came swiftly and viciously, exactly as Victoria had predicted. Charles Langford released a statement within hours, expressing deep concern about his daughter's emotional vulnerability and the opportunistic individuals exploiting her grief. Conservative media outlets ran stories questioning Ethan's credibility, digging up every gap in his employment history, every financial struggle, painting him as a con artist who'd waited 16 years to cash in on a dead teenager's legacy. But something unexpected happened too. Musicians began sharing their own stories. A cellist who'd lost her career to arthritis, a composer who'd spent a decade working retail after a nervous breakdown, a pianist who'd survived a stroke and had to relearn everything with his left hand. They flooded social media with the hashtag Margaret Chen had started. Second movement, referring to the part of the song Ethan had written, the part about resilience and transformation. Within 48 hours, the narrative began to shift. This wasn't just about one janitor claiming credit for a Dead Boys song. It was about every artist who'd been knocked down and told they were finished. Every talented person who'd faced obstacles that had nothing to do with their ability and everything to do with circumstances beyond their control. Ethan watched it unfold from his apartment, Sophie curled against his side, both of them scrolling through messages of support that kept pouring in. "Daddy, this lady says you inspired her to go back to painting," Sophie said, pointing at her tablet. "She stopped for 12 years because her hands got shaky, but now she's trying again." "That's wonderful, Firefly. And this man says he's a music teacher and he wants to use your story in his class to show his students that making mistakes doesn't mean you're not good enough." Each message was a small miracle, proof that truth mattered more than perfect narratives. But they also carried weight. These people were investing hope in Ethan's story, believing that if he could rebuild, maybe they could too. The pressure of that responsibility sat heavy on his chest. His phone rang. "Victoria. Have you seen the news?" she asked. "Some of it, hard to avoid." "My father is escalating. He's calling emergency board meetings, threatening to remove me as CEO if I continue with the foundation. James says he's also filed a motion to freeze Sterling's charitable funding, pending investigation of potential misuse of corporate resources." Victoria's voice was steady, but Ethan heard the strain beneath it. "He's not going to stop until one of us breaks." "Then maybe I should step back. Let this cool down before—" "No." The word was absolute. "Ethan, we knew this would be hard. We knew my father would fight. Backing down now doesn't make it stop. It just proves to him that intimidation works. But your position is not worth protecting if it means living under his control for the rest of my life." Victoria paused. "I've spent 32 years being the daughter Charles Langford wanted. The perfect student, the perfect executive, the perfect reflection of his vision, and I'm done. Whatever happens with the board, whatever I lose, it's worth it to finally be free." Sophie was watching Ethan with those two old eyes. He thought about what kind of example he was setting, what lessons she was learning about standing your ground versus knowing when to retreat. "What do you need from me?" he asked Victoria. "Keep telling the truth, keep being exactly who you are, and trust that the right outcome will find us, even if it's not the one we expected. The memorial concert was scheduled for 2 weeks after the press conference. Carnegie Hall, made possible by a donation from an anonymous benefactor who turned out to be one of Sterling Industries' board members, a woman who'd been quietly fighting Charles Langford's authoritarian rule for years. Ethan had never performed at Carnegie Hall, had never imagined he would. Now he had 2 weeks to prepare a 20-minute performance of a piece he'd written 16 years ago, with a hand that could barely manage 10 minutes of complex playing without cramping. Victoria hired a physical therapist who specialized in musicians with injuries. Dr. Sarah Kim was in her 50s, had survived her own career-ending accident, and had no patience for self-pity. "Your hand is damaged, not useless," she said during their first session, manipulating Ethan's scarred fingers with clinical efficiency. "You've been favoring it, compensating, building bad habits that make the limitations worse. We're going to retrain your muscle memory and extend your endurance. It will hurt, and you will want to quit. Don't." The sessions were brutal. Dr. Kim pushed Ethan past his perceived limits, forcing him to play scales until his hand screamed, then pushing further. But slowly, incrementally, something shifted. His endurance increased. His accuracy improved. The music began to flow again, not with the effortless precision of his youth, but with something rawer and more honest. "You play like someone who's earned every note," Dr. Kim said after a particularly grueling session. "That's rare. Most technically perfect musicians sound hollow because they've never had to fight for their art. You fight for every measure, and it shows." Is that good or bad? It's real. And real always wins over perfect, given enough time. Meanwhile, Victoria was fighting her own battle. The board meeting was contentious and public, with Charles attempting to paint his daughter as emotionally unstable and fiscally irresponsible. But Victoria came prepared. She presented projections showing how the foundation could enhance Sterling's reputation, attracted detailed budgets demonstrating fiscal responsibility, and reminded the board that she'd increased company value by 40% in her 5 years as CEO. "My father believes loyalty means obedience," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the boardroom. "I believe loyalty means doing what's right for this company's future, even when it's uncomfortable." The Emerging Artists Foundation represents Sterling's commitment to supporting talent regardless of circumstances. It demonstrates that we value substance over pedigree, resilience over privilege. If the board disagrees with those values, then perhaps I'm not the right CEO for this company. It was a calculated risk, essentially daring them to fire her. Charles went pale with fury, but several board members exchanged glances. One of them, the elderly woman who'd funded the Carnegie Hall rental, spoke up. "I think it's time we acknowledge that Sterling Industries has been too insular for too long. We've prioritized connections over competence, breeding over ability. Victoria's foundation corrects that imbalance. I move we approve the funding and cease this witch hunt against our CEO." The vote was close, but Victoria won. Barely. And at the cost of permanently fracturing her relationship with her father. Charles stood and walked out without a word, his exit a silent declaration of war that everyone in the room understood. "That's it then," Victoria said to James afterward, her voice hollow. "No going back now." "No going back," James agreed, "but going forward might be better than you think." The first rehearsal at Carnegie Hall was terrifying. Ethan stood on the stage where legends had performed, Sophie and Victoria sitting in the front row of the empty hall, and felt completely inadequate. "I can't do this," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "This hall has hosted Horowitz, Rubinstein, Ma. I'm a janitor with a busted hand." "You're a composer performing his own work," Victoria called back. "That's all that matters." "Easy for you to say. You don't have to sit here and listen to me butcher it." Sophie stood up. "Daddy, remember what you told me when I was scared to read out loud in class?" Ethan managed a weak smile. "That being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway." Sophie climbed onto the stage, taking his hand. "You're going to be great, because you always are when you play from your heart." The simple faith in her voice steadied him. Ethan sat at the piano, a magnificent Steinway that made the one at the Sterling party look like a toy, and placed his hands on the keys. The opening notes of the melody filled the hall, pure and clear and achingly familiar. This was David's theme, the part Ethan had given away. But now he played it knowing its full context, understanding how it fit into the larger architecture of the piece. The first movement flowed into the second, the bridge he'd written modulating from grief to acceptance. His right hand cramped at measure 47, just as Dr. Kim had predicted, but he pushed through it, letting his left hand carry more of the weight, adjusting the dynamics to accommodate his limitations. The second movement built to its climax, then resolved into the third, the ending David had never heard. This was where Ethan had always poured his own story, his own understanding of love and loss and the courage it took to keep going. The notes spoke of resilience, of transformation, of choosing to create beauty even when the world insisted you were broken. When he finished, silence filled Carnegie Hall. Then Sophie started clapping, her small hands creating enormous sound in the empty space. Victoria joined her, standing, her face wet with tears. "That," Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion, "is what 5,000 people need to hear." The thought of 5,000 people made Ethan's stomach drop, but he nodded. 2 weeks. He had 2 weeks to make peace with the past and prepare for a future he'd stopped believing was possible. David's parents arrived 3 days before the concert. Ethan met them at their hotel, his heart pounding with a combination of anticipation and dread. Margaret Chen embraced him immediately, but David's father, Robert, held back. He was a quiet man, an engineer who processed the world through logic and evidence. He studied Ethan with assessing eyes. "My son wrote about you constantly that summer," Robert said finally. "He said you were the most talented musician at the camp, but also the most overlooked. He was frustrated by that, angry on your behalf." David was generous with his praise. David was accurate in his assessments. Robert pulled a folder from his bag. "These are his notebooks from composition class. Look at the margins." Ethan opened the folder. David's neat handwriting filled the pages, but in the margins were notes in different ink. Ask Ethan about harmonic progression. Show Ethan the diminished seventh resolution. Ethan would know how to fix this transition. "He consulted you on everything," Robert said. "Even pieces he claimed as entirely his own. You were his collaborator long before the song for Victoria." The revelation shook Ethan. "I didn't know. I thought I was just helping occasionally, not—" "You were his creative partner," Margaret said gently. David knew it. We know it now. And it's time the world knew it too. Robert stepped closer, his expression softening. "My son died believing he'd created something meaningful because you gave him that gift. But you've spent 16 years believing you had to hide your contribution to honor his memory. That was never what David wanted. He wanted you to succeed, to be recognized, to use your gift fully." "How do you know?" Robert pulled out one more paper, a letter, yellowed with age, in David's handwriting. "He wrote this 2 days before the accident. We found it sealed in his desk with instructions to give it to you if anything happened to him. But we couldn't find you. You disappeared from the music world completely." Ethan took the letter with trembling hands. The envelope was addressed simply, "For Ethan." He opened it, aware of both parents watching him. The letter was short, David's handwriting shaky but determined. "Ethan, if you're reading this, something went wrong. Either the leukemia or something else, but I'm gone and you're still there. Good. You deserve to still be there. You deserve everything I won't get to have. I need you to know something. The song wasn't charity. You didn't give it to me out of pity. We created it together, my feelings, your genius for translating emotion into music. That's collaboration, not sacrifice. And collaboration is valuable. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I'm writing this because I know you, Ethan. I know you'll try to disappear. You'll convince yourself that hiding is noble, that being invisible is safer, but it's not. It's just another form of dying. So here's what I need from you. Don't hide. Don't let the world convince you that talent without privilege is worthless. Don't let one piece of music define your entire future. Create more. Share more. Be more. And if anyone ever questions whether you deserved recognition for the song, tell them. Tell them the truth. That we wrote it together. That collaboration made it better than either of us could have created alone. That your contribution mattered. Promise me, Ethan. Promise you won't spend your life being less than you are. Your friend always, David." Ethan read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Sophie had told him he deserved happy. Victoria had given him permission to stop hiding. Margaret had blessed his truth-telling. But this, David's own words, released from beyond death, this was absolution. He knew, Ethan whispered. He knew I'd hide. He knew you, Margaret corrected. And he loved you enough to call you on your self-protective instincts before they could ruin your life. Robert cleared his throat gruffly. So the question is, will you honor his request? Will you stop hiding? Ethan folded the letter carefully, placing it in his jacket pocket over his heart. I'm performing at Carnegie Hall in 3 days. I'd say I'm done hiding. The night before the concert, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table in his apartment, the letter from David in front of him, trying to memorize every word. Victoria found him there at 2 a.m. She'd started keeping a key to his apartment after the security detail flagged her as a regular visitor who shouldn't have to wait in the hallway. Can't sleep either? She asked, settling into the chair across from him. Terrified, Ethan admitted. Not of the performance, of what comes after. What do you think comes after? I don't know. That's what scares me. He met her eyes. For 16 years, I knew exactly what my life was. Limited, small, but predictable. Now everything's changing, and I have no idea if I'm ready. Victoria reached across the table, taking his hand. Nobody's ever ready for the life they actually want. If they were, they'd already be living it. Is this what you wanted? Defying your father? Risking your position? Fighting battles you didn't have to fight? No, Victoria said honestly. What I wanted was for everyone to magically understand that I deserved respect without me having to demand it. What I wanted was for my father to suddenly see me as an equal instead of an extension of his will. What I wanted was easy transformation with no conflict or cost. But that's not real. That's not real, she agreed. Real transformation requires breaking things, including the version of yourself you've outgrown. They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the table. Then Victoria spoke again, her voice quieter. Can I ask you something? The song. When you were writing it, did you think about me at all? Or was it entirely about David's feelings? The question surprised him. Why do you want to know? Because I've been wondering if some part of you understood even then, that the song wasn't just about David loving someone unattainable, it was about you loving something you thought you could never have. Ethan's breath caught. What do I supposedly love? Recognition, respect, the right to be seen as you actually are instead of how circumstances define you. Victoria's gray eyes were intense. Every note of that song is about loving something beautiful and accepting you can't possess it. David felt that about me. But didn't you feel that about music itself? About the career you knew you'd never have because you were poor and self-taught and didn't fit the mold? The observation was so accurate it hurt. Ethan had never articulated it that way, but Victoria was right. The song had been a double mirror, David's unrequited love for her, Ethan's unrequited love for a future the world insisted he couldn't have. Maybe, he said, maybe I wrote myself into it without realizing. Then tomorrow isn't just about honoring David's memory. It's about claiming what you've always loved, finally allowing yourself to possess it. Victoria squeezed his hand. You're not unattainable anymore, Ethan. You get to have this. The words settled into his chest like an anchor, grounding him. Victoria was right. Tomorrow wasn't about proving anything to Charles Langford or critics or anyone who doubted his story. It was about finally allowing himself to be the musician he'd always been, hidden or not. Thank you, he said quietly, for seeing that. Thank you for reminding me that some things are worth fighting for. Victoria stood, but didn't release his hand. Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we change everything. Carnegie Hall was sold out. 5,000 seats filled with musicians, music lovers, Sterling Industries employees who'd been given free tickets, and journalists covering what had become the most talked about performance of the year. Backstage, Ethan paced in his dressing room, wearing the suit Victoria had insisted on buying him. Sophie sat on the couch, carefully coloring a card she'd made that said, "You're the best daddy in the whole world." "You're going to wear a hole in the carpet," Dr. Kim observed from the doorway. "Stop pacing and stretch your hand. You need it loose, not tense." Ethan obeyed, running through the finger exercises that had become ritual. His right hand responded better now, the months of therapy showing results. It would never be what it was before the accident, but it was enough. It had to be enough. Victoria appeared, radiant in a deep blue gown. 5 minutes. Are you ready? No, but I'm doing it anyway. That's my favorite kind of ready. She kissed his cheek, a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. David would be so proud of you. Margaret and Robert Chen arrived next, Margaret carrying flowers for after the performance. We'll be in the front row, she said, right next to Sophie and Victoria. Your people. Your people. The phrase hit Ethan hard. For so long it had been just him and Sophie against the world. Now he had Victoria, the Chens, Dr. Kim, James the attorney, even some of the Sterling Industries board members. People who'd chosen to stand with him when it would have been easier not to. The stage manager knocked. Mr. Hale, they're ready for you. Ethan took a deep breath. Sophie jumped up and hugged him fiercely. Remember, Daddy, brave doesn't mean not scared. I remember, Firefly. Walking onto the Carnegie Hall stage was surreal. The lights were blinding, the audience a dark sea of faces he couldn't distinguish. But the piano waited at center stage, gleaming under the spots, and that was familiar enough to ground him. Ethan sat, adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys. The hall fell silent. He thought about David, dying at 17 with so much unlived life ahead of him. He thought about Victoria, trapped in her father's expectations until one song cracked her armor. He thought about Sophie, watching from the front row, learning that starting over was possible. And he thought about himself, the boy who'd written music in basement apartments, the man who'd cleaned toilets to keep his daughter fed, the musician who'd given away his best work and spent 16 years believing that was the end of his story. It wasn't the end, it was just the second movement, the part about transformation. Ethan began to play. The first notes were David's melody, pure and clear, and filled with longing. Ethan played it exactly as he had at the Sterling party, but now the audience knew the full story. They knew this was a 17-year-old boy's declaration of love, preserved by a friend who'd understood its value. The first movement built to its emotional peak, then shifted. The bridge came, the modulation from E minor to G major that David had never solved. Ethan played it with absolute certainty, the resolution he'd found at 17 still perfect 16 years later. The second movement was where Ethan always lost himself. This was his voice, his understanding of what came after loss. The music spoke of grief transmuted into acceptance, of loving something without demanding it love you back, of finding grace in letting go. His right hand cramped at measure 63. Ethan adjusted smoothly, letting his left hand carry the melody while his right recovered. The audience wouldn't know it was adaptation rather than composition, and that was fine. Music was about the effect, not the perfection of its creation. The third movement began, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. This ending, the one David had never heard, was no longer about resignation. It was about renewal, about second chances and the courage to claim them. He thought about Victoria standing up to her father, about Margaret Chen blessing the truth, about Sophie believing her daddy deserved happiness, about Dr. Kim pushing him past his perceived limits, about every person who'd shared their own second movement story online. The music swelled, building to a climax that was both triumphant and bittersweet, because renewal didn't erase what came before. It honored it. David's love, Ethan's sacrifice, Victoria's grief, all of it had value. All of it mattered, even as they moved beyond it into something new. The final chord resonated through Carnegie Hall, hanging in the air like a question finally answered. Then silence. Ethan lifted his hands from the keys, his heart pounding, unsure if the performance had succeeded or failed. The applause started in the front row, Sophie on her feet, clapping with her whole body. Then Victoria stood, then the Chens, then the entire audience rose in a standing ovation that shook the rafters of Carnegie Hall. Ethan stood, his vision blurring with tears. He bowed, overwhelmed, then gestured to the front row where David's parents sat. They stood and joined him on stage, Margaret embracing him while Robert shook his hand firmly. "David's here," Margaret whispered in his ear. "Can't you feel him? He's so proud." and impossibly, Ethan could feel it. Not literally, he didn't believe in ghosts, but spiritually, emotionally, he felt his friend's presence in the music that still echoed in the hall. David's love, given voice through Ethan's hands, finally acknowledged as the collaboration it had always been. The reception afterward was a blur. Musicians wanted to talk about the foundation. Journalists asked about his plans. Board members from Sterling Industries expressed support for Victoria's initiative. Someone from Juilliard asked if he'd consider teaching. But the moment that mattered most came 2 hours in when a teenager approached nervously. "Mr. Hale? I'm Marcus. Not the rich Marcus, different one." The kid laughed self-consciously. "I'm a scholarship student at a music academy. I heard about your story and I just wanted to say thank you for showing us that not fitting the mold doesn't mean we're not good enough." Ethan looked at this kid, 17, awkward, brilliantly talented, but overlooked, and saw himself. "What do you play?" he asked. "Violin, but I'm also trying to compose, and it's hard because I can't afford lessons, and—" Marcus stopped. "Sorry, you don't need to hear my problems." "Actually, I do." Ethan pulled out a business card, newly printed, still strange to carry. "The Emerging Artists Foundation starts accepting applications next month. We're specifically looking for musicians who've faced obstacles. Email me your composition portfolio." Marcus's eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Seriously. And Marcus, don't hide your talent. Don't let anyone convince you that being different means being less. Got it?" "Got it." The kid clutched the card like it was gold. "Thank you. Really." Watching Marcus walk away, Ethan felt the final piece of his transformation click into place. This was why it had all mattered. The truth-telling, the concert, the battle with Charles Langford. Not for Ethan's own redemption, but so kids like Marcus could see a path forward. Victoria found him as the crowd was thinning. "You're smiling, really smiling, not performing smiling." "I think I just figured out what comes next," Ethan said. "Which is?" "Exactly what we planned. The foundation, the mentorship, helping musicians who need second chances." He took her hand. "And writing again. Actually writing new music, not just performing old pieces." "You're ready for that?" "I'm terrified of that, but I'm doing it anyway." He pulled her closer. "What about you? What comes next for the formidable Victoria Langford?" She was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "My father hasn't spoken to me since the board vote. Half the executives at Sterling think I'm making a mistake. My engagement is broken. My reputation is complicated, and I'm running a foundation that will probably cost more than it earns for years. Sounds terrible. It sounds like freedom." Victoria's smile was genuine, reaching all the way to her eyes for the first time since Ethan had met her. "I'm making my own choices, living my own life. Turns out that's worth more than my father's approval." David would agree. David would be delighted. Victoria glanced around the emptying hall. "You know what I keep thinking about? That conversation we had 16 years ago, the one David told you about. When I said wanting didn't matter, that duty came first." I remember him mentioning it. "I was 17 and convinced I had no agency, that my future was predetermined by my last name and my father's expectations." She turned to face Ethan fully. "But standing here now, having fought for something I believed in and won, I realize I was wrong. Wanting does matter. Choosing matters. And it's never too late to start." Sophie appeared, dragging Dr. Kim behind her. "Daddy, Dr. Kim says you played perfect." "I didn't say perfect," Dr. Kim corrected. "I said exceptionally well considering the limitations." "That's basically perfect," Sophie insisted. "It was pretty perfect," Victoria agreed, and the warmth in her voice made Ethan's chest tight. They left Carnegie Hall together. Ethan, Sophie, Victoria, the Chens, Dr. Kim, a chosen family formed from shared truth and mutual support. Outside, snow was falling, turning Manhattan into something magical and new. "Where to now?" Margaret asked. "Should we celebrate?" "Ice cream," Sophie suggested immediately. "It's December," Robert pointed out. "Ice cream doesn't have a season," Sophie said with 7-year-old certainty. They found an all-night diner 3 blocks away, cramming into a booth meant for 4, ordering sundaes and coffee and talking about everything and nothing. David's name came up frequently, but it wasn't painful anymore. It was celebratory, remembering him as he'd actually been, flawed and generous and gone too soon. He would have loved this, Margaret said, gesturing at the crowded booth, the melting ice cream, the easy laughter. All of you together because of him, but not trapped by him. Second movement, Ethan said quietly. Second movement, Victoria agreed. Months passed. The foundation launched successfully, accepting its first cohort of musicians. Ethan split his time between directing the program and composing new work. Slower than he'd written at 17, but deeper, more honest. His hand would never be what it was, but Dr. Kim was right. The limitations forced him to be more creative, more intentional. Sophie thrived, no longer carrying the weight of her father's hidden grief. She started piano lessons with Dr. Kim, showing early signs of her father's talent, but also her own distinct voice. Victoria restructured Sterling Industries, implementing policies that prioritized talent over connections, merit over pedigree. Charles Langford remained a shareholder but had no operational control, relegated to angry board meetings where his influence continued to wane. Some of the older board members left. Younger, more progressive members took their place. And slowly, imperceptibly, Victoria stopped being Charles Langford's daughter and became simply Victoria, brilliant, fierce, and finally free to define success on her own terms. 1 year after the Carnegie Hall concert, Ethan finished a new composition. It was different from anything he'd written before, less about longing and loss, more about gratitude and growth. He called it Second Movement and dedicated it to everyone who'd ever had to start over. The premiere was held at a smaller venue, more intimate than Carnegie Hall, but no less meaningful. Sophie sat in the front row next to Victoria, both of them beaming. The audience was filled with foundation recipients, students, musicians who'd found their own second chances. Ethan played the piece with confidence born from a year of steady work, steady support, steady belief that he deserved to be there. When he finished, the applause was warm and genuine, celebrating not just the music but what it represented. Afterward, Victoria found him backstage. It's beautiful. Different from the first piece, but equally powerful. It's honest, Ethan said. That's all I know how to write now. Honest is good. Victoria moved closer, her expression turning serious. Can I tell you something? That first night when you played at the party and I heard David's song, I didn't just recognize the music, I recognized something in you. What? The same trapped feeling I'd been carrying for 16 years. The same sense of living a life that wasn't quite yours. She took his hand. You gave me permission to break free, not just by telling the truth about the song, but by showing me that starting over was possible, that it was worth it. You gave me the same thing, Ethan said, permission to stop hiding, to believe I deserved recognition. They stood together in the quiet backstage, the sounds of celebration muffled through the walls. Sophie appeared, demanding both of them come cut the cake someone had provided. As they walked back into the reception together, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought them here. A song written in grief and love. A secret kept for 16 years. A chance performance that shattered carefully constructed lives. A choice to tell the truth despite the cost. All of it had led to this moment. Sophie laughing with other musicians' children, Victoria free from her father's shadow, Ethan finally living the life he'd thought was lost forever. Not the exact life he'd imagined at 17, but something better because it was real. David's letter was still in Ethan's jacket pocket, carried every day like a talisman. Promise me you won't spend your life being less than you are. Promise kept. The second movement wasn't about returning to what was lost. It was about transforming loss into something new, something stronger, something that honored the past while refusing to be imprisoned by it. Ethan Hale had written music that changed lives. First David's, then his own, then countless others who needed proof that second chances existed. The song that had once symbolized everything he'd given away had become the gift that gave back, opening doors he'd thought were permanently closed. And in the end, that was the truest ending Ethan could have written. Not perfect resolution, not fairy tale happiness, but honest transformation. The kind that required courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to be seen, the kind that made beautiful music possible. Sophie tugged at his hand. Daddy, they want you to make a speech. What should I say? Tell them about being brave, Sophie suggested. About doing it anyway. So Ethan did. He stood in front of the celebration, Victoria and Sophie by his side, and told the truth one more time. Not about the past, but about the future they were all building together. One where talent mattered more than privilege, where obstacles were acknowledged but not accepted as endings, where second movements were always possible. David Chen taught me that collaboration makes us stronger, Ethan said, that asking for help isn't weakness, and that the best music comes from honesty, even when honesty is painful. So here's to second movements, to new beginnings, to all of us brave enough to keep creating despite everything that tries to stop us. The applause was thunderous. Sophie beamed. Victoria's eyes shone with tears and pride, and something that looked remarkably like hope. And somewhere, Ethan liked to think, David Chen was smiling too, proud of his friend for finally claiming the life he'd always deserved. The song had ended. The second movement was complete, but the music, the real music, the kind that changed lives and opened hearts, that music would keep playing forever.